Did you know there's a whole single kart version of Double Dash the world has never seen? Or that movement of Metroid Prime's Morph Ball was based on a tire? Or that Resident Evil's rocket launcher came from a terrible movie? For the last few years, we've combed through hundreds of foreign magazines looking for interesting tidbits to translate into English, and that's where most of today's info came from. We stumbled upon some German and Japanese GameCube game interviews during our research, all bursting with facts we'd never heard before, probably because the info never made it to English-speaking outlets. So unless you were a frequent flyer between Japan and Germany in the early 2000s, you probably haven't heard the stuff in this video. Today we're going to focus on Mario Kart Double Dash, Resident Evil's Remake, and Metroid Prime. But seeing as Metroid Prime 4 was recently shown off for the first time, we thought we'd start there. This first segment has some new information from our own interview with an ex-Retro developer, as well as an interview from Germany's Endzone magazine in April 2003. Let's take a brief look at Endzone first, which talks to Shigeru Miyamoto, as well as executive producer Steve Barcia, lead designer Mark Pacini, and designer Carl Deckard. Early in the interview, the devs are asked about Metroid Prime multiplayer. Metroid Prime 2 Echoes got multiplayer a few years later, but apparently Retro seriously discussed adding multiplayer to the original Prime. Barcia told Endzone, "When we were discussing development of the game, we thought about all the options like multiplayer, but our focus was definitely on the single-player mode. We wanted to focus all of our energy on making this single-player game the best game possible. The team tried to stay away from first-person shooter conventions in order to differentiate Prime, leading to more focus on exploration." The interviewer also asks if there's any specific movies or games that influenced the team while working on Prime. Barcia says the team took their cues from movies, intensively watching tons of different films while thinking about how the game could be similar. He goes on to say, "Also, any science fiction movie with a strong female lead was a candidate for inspiration. For example, the Alien series influenced us a lot." Now, this next question is why we really wanted to bring up this Endzone interview. The devs are asked if there's something they're particularly proud of in Prime, to which they say the Morph Ball. Mark Pacini says it was extremely challenging and a risky aspect of the game, requiring well-designed game mechanics as well as intelligent puzzles. Miyamoto even thinks the entire game's success hinged on it, saying if that experiment had failed, the whole project would probably have been shut down. But it went well, and so we knew pretty early on that Metroid Prime was going to be a solid project. So why did we want to talk about this point so much? Well, because the guy who actually programmed the Morph Ball into Prime never gets the recognition. Even after working on such an important piece of the game, Scott Johnson was credited in Prime all the way down here as additional contributors. We reached out to Scott to get some insight and ask him about his work on Prime. Scott was happy to chat about making the Morph Ball and told us, "Mark Pacini was working with Miyamoto and telling me what the design was supposed to be. He said they wanted the ball to roll around like a tire because a person has a specific orientation. So I worked out with him that they wanted it to primarily roll like a tire, but in some cases it could roll around like a marble if the physics dictated it, such as when colliding." Scott says he didn't have to iterate on it much, and Prime's custom physics engine handled everything pretty well. He went on to say, "But when Samus got going in a particular direction, I applied an aligning torque to the ball that was proportional to the speed. That made her roll like a tire. Miyamoto and Pacini loved it, and it shipped that way. I implemented what Mark Pacini wanted. It was great that he was able to articulate what he wanted." Miyamoto said the entire project's success hinged on the Morph Ball working well. So why did the guy who made it all work get credited in such an unspecified way after everyone else? According to Scott, he couldn't endure the crunch, which other Metroid devs called a death march, so he resigned. He said he had to choose between Samus and his marriage. And we heard similar stories from his co-workers, many of which didn't make it to the finish line either. "I resigned entirely from Retro because I couldn't work 60 hours per week and then worse for months on end and stay married," he told us. "It was cultural in the studios that I worked in. I left Retro to work at Electronic Arts Tiburon, and they worked me even harder. I kept thinking that it was lack of planning or investment that created the work hours, but it was just the way things were, and they were not going to change. I ended up leaving games after only 18 months at EA Tiburon. I could not have 2 kids and work in games. I was old at 35 years old. Scott doesn't make games anymore, but we wanted to use this opportunity to highlight a former dev who rarely gets the praise they deserve. Miyamoto said the Morph Ball was one of the most important aspects of Prime's gameplay, but if it wasn't for Scott, Metroid might have had to crawl. Next up is the GameCube's Resident Evil Remake, also known as Remake. These days you can find the Resident Evil Remake on Xbox and PlayStation, but it was originally a GameCube exclusive. Nintendo and Capcom signed an exclusivity deal to have the Resident Evil Remake, Resident Evil 0, and the highly anticipated Resident Evil 4 only on GameCube. They'd even do exclusive ports of Resident Evil 2, 3, and Code Veronica. Resident Evil Remake would release first, and to promote it, director Shinji Mikami and producer Hiroyuki Kobayashi sat down for an interview with Japan's Nintendo Dream magazine. We had the whole thing translated, and a few highlights stuck out, like Mikami's perfectionism. He says he went around Osaka game stores the day before Resident Evil Remake's release. Customers didn't recognize him, but all the shopkeepers were starstruck. At one store, they had a demo unit set up, but Mikami wasn't satisfied with the brightness on the TV and fiddled with it to make the game look right. There was no TV remote though, so all his twiddling ended in failure. He dropped by the same shop a couple days later to make sure the brightness was how he wanted. From here, the conversation shifts to Mikami's inspirations for Resident Evil and the stress of survival horror. Mikami said, wanting to survive somehow, but being unable to do anything against the enemy except run away, is, I think, a big difference between movies and games. If you ask me, if that kind of fear is interesting in a game, I'd say no, so I made it so you can attack the enemy. He mentions one inspiration for letting us attack enemies was the last scene in Jaws. That last scene is a perfect balance of tension and relaxation, he explained. The mast's falling so fast, there's no way to stop it, so there's a state of mind where the protagonist knows if they don't act quick, they're dead. Basically, Mikami wanted attacking and running to both be options for the player and tried to communicate that duality with the game's first zombie encounter. So he made that first zombie stronger than all the others. We made it especially hard to kill, he said. After players complain, I can't kill it, they learn to run away for the first time. We spent a lot of time thinking how to make players understand the essence of Resident Evil isn't just to fight, but sometimes you'll need to flee to survive. That's Jaws' influence, but Mikami brings up another movie inspiration we've never heard before. That the reason you get a rocket launcher after beating the game is because he saw the 1976 horror film Grizzly. It's a crappy Jaws ripoff about a grizzly bear, basically, but the ending's a work of art. That scene right there's why Resident Evil gives you a rocket launcher. The giant bear's defeated with a rocket launcher, Mikami told the magazine. The thrill of blowing off zombies' heads comes from Jaws, and the rocket launcher at the end comes from Grizzly. I bought the DVD of Grizzly and said, this is it, this is it, this is it. A rocket launcher. No one knows this movie. Then I showed Grizzly to the dev team. Mikami also mentions how he really liked the Japanese TV show Hiroshi Kawaguchi Expedition Team, and though he wanted the game set in a Western-style mansion, the show inspired him to give the mansion some diverse outdoor areas. To get inspiration for the mansion's design, Mikami took a trip to Kobe, Japan, where there's dozens of historical Western mansions built by settlers, some of which are open to the public. Early in development, Mikami felt a Western-style mansion would be a great backdrop, but he didn't care much for the real thing. Mikami said, "At first I thought they were amazing. The ceilings were 10 feet high and the doors were huge. I was really impressed by the first house and thought, foreigners sure make things different. But after the second mansion, I thought, okay, I think I get it, and by the third, I was ready to go home. The interview wraps up with Mikami promoting the Resident Evil 2 and 3 ports heading to GameCube, but laments that a lot of fans thought the ports were also going to be full-on remakes. The team actually just wanted them on the GameCube, so if you enjoyed the first game, you could jump into the sequels without buying another console. They literally say they don't care if the ports make money, they just don't want new fans to have to buy PlayStations to experience the rest of the story. How kind of them. Now it's time for Double Dash. This next interview is from a different issue of Nintendo Dream we had translated with a ton of developer insights. It features key players from Nintendo EAD, the development division that made the game, including Double Dash Chief Director Kiyoshi Mizuki and two of its producers, Shinya Takahashi and Tadashi Sugiyama. These three have all shaped Nintendo, but Sugiyama is kind of a legend. He joined Nintendo in '83 and worked on every Mario Kart before Double Dash, as well as Zelda 2, Mario 2, and F-Zero X. But enough backstory, let's get to the trivia. Early in the interview, the conversation inevitably shifts to Double Dash's two-seater karts. The game was getting an almost simultaneous worldwide release, so its name had to work worldwide too, sounding good while also communicating the game's new mechanic. They brainstormed titles that included Twin and Tandem, but they all sounded weak or forced. Eventually, they thought up Double Dash, and immediately knew it was perfect. But how did the tandem mechanic itself come to be? According to Takahashi, Mario Kart is more of a party game than a racer, so the team started thinking of elements that'd get players more involved with each other. The concept of two players in one kart emerged, but experimenting with the core mechanics of such a huge IP came with a lot of pressure. Mario Kart's always been a reliable system seller for Nintendo, and messing with success could irreparably damage the brand and the GameCube itself, so failure was not an option. The possibility of two-seater karts ruining the game instead of evolving it terrified them. So much so, they actually developed a whole single kart version of Double Dash alongside the double kart version. They thought of it like an insurance policy, so if tandem karts sucked or fans hated it, they could quickly backpedal to a more traditional Mario Kart experience. The single kart build was worked on all the way up to the final year before launch. It sounds like the reason it took them so long to gain confidence in double karts is because they were initially going to have both drivers side by side, kind of like motorcycles with sidecars. But they realized 8 double-wide karts on one track wasn't going to work all too well, with everyone bouncing off each other and disrupting the game flow due to the sheer width of the vehicles. After trying out a few different setups, they arrived at how karts look in the release version, one driver in front of the other. But that gave them a whole new problem, the guy in the back blocking the view of the guy in the front. After using sprite-based karts in the first 3 games, this was Nintendo's first stab at a fully 3D Mario Kart, and they'd taken great efforts squeezing as much detail as they could into every character, so they wanted to make sure we could see them. The fix they came up with was letting racers swap seats on the fly. Double Dash was pretty rigid at this stage of development. Characters like Mario and Luigi were forcibly bundled together as a team, and you couldn't mix and match other drivers. Director Mizuki said they'd initially considered forcing characters to switch seats every lap. Quote, "At first we had an idea of forcing a swap after each lap, but if we did that, it wouldn't be possible for kids and parents to play together. But we want small kids' grandpas and grandmas to play Mario Kart, which was a thought point of our decision making. The idea was grandpa could cover the more difficult task of driving, while a youngster raised hell with items. Letting players freely mix and match drivers was a tricky ask, since in past games, speed and maneuverability were based on body weight. When the team tried combining the weight of 2 characters to define the stats of one kart, they ran into problems. Mizuki said, "At first we tested everything, like changing how karts moved based on the weights of the 2 characters, or having a kart's behavior change when characters swapped. But if the stats only changed a little bit, it'd be difficult to understand when actually playing. And when we made the stats change dramatically, that made it feel difficult to play. So ultimately, having stats change with the karts was the easiest to understand visually." producer Sugiyama had been the visual director on Mario Kart 64. According to him, one of the goals for this GameCube sequel was to achieve everything they couldn't do on N64. 64's characters were just 2D sprites on one polygon, pivoting on a single point. That made steep slopes and falls look awkward, which is partly why 64's courses were mostly designed to be flat. But with fully 3D karts on the cube, the team could put pivoting points on each tire, resulting in dynamic movement that would fit almost any terrain. They were eager to test how steep a slope fully 3D karts could handle, so one of the first courses they worked on was DK Mountain. Mizuki recalled, "We started making courses from the Mario circuit. We went through them and talked about how it was fun, but ordinary. We decided we wanted a bit more of an adventure and started making that mountain course. But once you're making such a distinctive course, it makes you also want ones where you can just do ordinary time attacks." Their idea of an ordinary time attack course was Baby Park, one of the next levels they worked on. At this point in the interview, they drop some deep Baby Park lore. Sugiyama says Baby Park was also inspired by slick track karting, where a slick surface made drifting easier around an oval course. The devs originally thought Baby Park would just be a test level, but they had so much chaotic fun, they kept it in the game. There was a lot of testing and tweaking on Double Dash. The devs had to frequently adjust the drifting mechanic as course designs changed. Then they'd have to adjust courses to not mess up drifting, constantly tweaking throughout development. One thing the team routinely tested was the game's accessibility for newcomers. Mizuki said, "We were aiming for it to be something people new to video games could fully enjoy. We gathered the kids and family members of Nintendo employees together and had them play a development version. Then us developers took the parts that people didn't enjoy and revised them as much as possible." From here, the interview shifts to Double Dash's new items, like the giant banana, which the devs say was pretty much made by accident. According to Sugiyama, "It wasn't something we were aiming for at first, we just made it bigger." Then Mizuki chimes in. "We were adjusting what the best size was for the regular banana, and setting the numerics to the max just happened to make it get big. But we thought it was funny." Mizuki says the same thing happened with Bowser's shell as well. They just played with the settings, and after making it huge as a joke, wound up liking the result. They also say Mario and Luigi's fireballs were inspired by a scrapped item that launched a scattering of 5 shells. The team tried it out, but there were way too many shells on screen, and it became a problem. It started out being a single fireball the brothers could launch. Mizuki said, "At first it was one fireball, but no matter what we did, it wasn't strong enough, even when we tried making it explode or burn. But they thought back to their unused 5 shells item and gave fireballs the same number and spread, and it fit great." Before coming up with the special heart item for Peach and Daisy, the team didn't know what to give them. The devs briefly considered giving the duo, quote, "umbrellas or something, for defense or to float down from heights, but they thought that'd be kinda useless and probably just slow them down." This idea would be revisited in Mario Kart 7, where players can use parasols as their gliders. A pretty unknown fact about Double Dash is that Miyamoto is the person who pushed for the game to have 16-player LAN battles using 2 GameCubes. This pairs up 2 players to a kart with 8 karts on the track. 16 racers meant a minimum of 16 characters, double the roster of Mario Kart 64. Originally, the team wanted to include Donkey Kong Jr., and they even made a character model for him. But ultimately, due to Diddy Kong being more popular, Diddy was chosen for the game. Diddy's model shares the same origins as his model in Mario Golf Toadstool Tour, but was tweaked to better fit Double Dash. Takahashi said, "Yes, the original model is the same. Changes were then added to suit each game separately." The team mentions they wanted to add more characters, but they had to keep things trim in order to hit their Christmas release window. What can be said about the GameCube that hasn't been said a million times already? Well, turns out it's a fair amount actually. Today we've put together over 20 minutes of interesting and lesser known facts about GameCube games just for your enjoyment, covering titles like Pokemon XD Gale of Darkness, Paper Mario The Thousand Year Door, Tales of Symphonia, Resident Evil's stellar remake, and Resident Evil 4, Sonic Adventure 1 and 2, The Wind Waker, and Twilight Princess, Mario Sunshine, and more. Yes, in celebration of our final release of Did You Know Gaming Extra, we thought we'd bust a huge load all in one go and give you guys a nice juicy double-length release. Not only that, but with Greg and I having helmed the series for all of these years, we thought we'd both take on the narration together. And with all that considered, let's start our fact bonanza with the Pokemon series. The GameCube had a few Pokemon games during its run, with 2 of the titles being full-blown single-player RPGs. These games had a slightly more dark approach to the usual cutesy style of the series that came before, with the game having a protagonist with a darker outfit and a more adult-oriented region, the Ore region, an urban, dry world inhabited by older people, and was actually inspired by the dry deserts of Phoenix, Arizona. In the second Pokemon RPG on the system, XD Gale of Darkness, a number of references can be found not just to the Pokemon anime, but other anime as well. Once the player reaches Mount Battle Zone 35, a player they can face has a team consisting of a Cacnea and a Chimecho. This trainer states, "I've heard someone has the same team combination as me. Do you know him or her?" This is a reference to the Pokemon anime, where James of Team Rocket carried a Cacnea and Chimecho during the Advanced Generation series, which was airing during Gale of Darkness's development. This isn't the game's only reference though. The title's Mecha Groudon vaguely spoofs robots from mecha anime, but there's a few instances of more precise parody. When the Mecha Groudon launches from underground, it comes up through a large fountain. This is referencing how the Mazinger Z launches in the 1972 anime of the same name, where the giant mech emerges from a fountain. Another Nintendo RPG series we want to mention is Paper Mario.
It's pretty much agreed that one of the best entries in the series, if not the best, was on the GameCube with The Thousand Year Door. And as you might expect, a big RPG like this has tons of references. After the game's 7th chapter, Bowser and Cammy will go to Poshley Heights looking for a crystal star, where at some point, Pennington will appear. Pennington will accuse the pair of being common thieves, to which Bowser responds, "What are you implying? I'm no little thief, And then the player has to select either I'm a remorseless king of evil, I'm the Shadow Thief, or I'm Koopa Koot. This second option, Shadow Thief, is a sly nod to another quality Mario RPG, Mario & Luigi Superstar Saga. In Superstar Saga, a character named Popple teams up with an amnesia-brained Bowser. Popple is a generic small-time thief with delusions of grandeur, and one of the nicknames he gives himself is the Shadow Thief. Let's keep this RPG train going with another beloved Cube title. The Tales franchise didn't really hit it big in the West until it came to the GameCube with Tales of Symphonia. Published by Namco, creators of many other popular series, the game has a small Easter egg which makes reference to another underappreciated series in their library, but it was fairly well hidden. There are a number of hidden costumes for the characters of the game, but one costume for Presea Combatir can only be unlocked by putting her in the lead of the party and going to Lezarino Company in Altamira, then entering the president's office, unlocking her the title of Dream Traveler, and an outfit reminiscent of Klonoa. Whilst wearing this costume, she'll make a habit of delivering Klonoa's signature catchphrase, though not with quite the same enthusiasm as the rabbit or dog or cat thing that Klonoa is. Presea's woohoo is delivered in a completely deadpan manner during optional skits and scenes where she wears the outfit. She talks normally whilst in battle, and these lines are not voiced by her voice actor in the English version of the game. However, if the player imports the title they earn to a new game, Presea will occasionally say woohoo as an end of battle phrase, but only up until a certain plot event.
One of the most graphically impressive games on the GameCube was easily the remake of Resident Evil. The attention to detail in this complete recreation of the original survival horror is phenomenal, not just in how it plays, but the extra flavor the developers injected into the experience. Some of these extra details might have eluded many players, however, such as with the tombstones found in the cemetery behind the Spencer Mansion. Each grave is marked with Greek text, which mean nothing on their own, but when translated from Greek into Latin characters, they will spell out Capcom. Another detail can be found within the game's item box, where players can store items if their inventory is too full. Despite the fact that players can never see inside of it due to the fixed camera angles, the actual item box in the remake isn't empty. It contains boxes labeled Soft Image, which is the name of the 3D modeling software used for the game. But by adding all these fine details to the remake which would never have been visible in the original, the language barrier of the developers would also be on show. Text was added to the various items that could be examined from the player's inventory, and with this additional small print, there were more chances for errors to be made. Upon inspecting the ink ribbons used for saving, they'll show ink ribbon for typewriter, Royal type, with the word Royal mistakenly including the letter I in the middle of it. The latest entry of the Resident Evil series at the time of the GameCube's lifespan was Resident Evil 4, a game which changed the way the series would play, but it didn't change the way players could appreciate the various items within it. Some of the game's weapons have a number of references hidden within them, such as the description of the broken butterfly, which reads, "This will make anyone's day." This line, as well as the fact that this weapon is a magnum, is a direct reference to the classic Dirty Harry quote,
"Go ahead, make my day,"
from the 1983 film Sudden Impact. Another homage to the world of cinema comes up with the minigun that the Gatling man carries, being based on the M134 from the Arnold Schwarzenegger blockbuster Terminator 2 Judgment Day, as well as the 1987 action romp Predator. But it isn't just cinema getting nods, as might be rather obvious with the Killer 7 Magnum, named after the Capcom game of the same name, which would release later the same year as Resident Evil 4, also produced by Shinji Mikami. The design of this gun, however, is inspired by cinema as well, being based on the AMT Hardballer from 1984's The Terminator.
Moving from scary to just a bit weird, Odama is a bizarre GameCube exclusive that somehow managed to blend pinball and warfare with a feudal Japan aesthetic. This was one of the last games published for the Cube by Nintendo and was designed by Seaman creator Yutaka Saito. But today's trivia is more interesting than the game's origins. If the player manages to reach the game's 11th stage, Karasuma Keep, it's possible to discover a hidden bonus level by blasting open the keep's main gate. This bonus level is a small piece of modern-day Kyoto, complete with trains, cars, 21st century citizens, and even Nintendo's own headquarters. And since we're talking about obscure games, the main antagonists of Custom Robo, the Z Syndicate, are certainly shrouded in mystery. For the duration of the game, many characters will try and guess what the Z in their name stands for. While the true meaning is never revealed, there is some interesting trivia surrounding what it could mean. During the A New Journey section of the game, some of the world's NPCs hanging out in the hub park will try to guess what it could mean, with some characters suggesting that it could possibly stand for Zelda, or maybe even Zebes. Zelda is of course a reference to the Legend of Zelda series, while Zebes is a nod to the planet Zebes, the home planet of Samus Aran in the Metroid series. And now for something completely different. This wasn't the only third-party game to mention the Legend of Zelda, so something not that completely different then, to be fair. In fact, one non-Nintendo game even featured Link. It must have been difficult for Namco to get Nintendo to agree to them putting Link in Soulcalibur II, but there was a convenient coincidence that made putting Link in the game a little easier. What we're talking about is the fact that the series characters, Nightmare, Yoshimitsu, and Siegfried, were already voiced by Nobuyuki Hiyama, who just so happened to be the voice actor for Link. Link was a big reason that many gamers bought this title on the Cube instead of other platforms, and despite the fact that Link only appeared once in the series, his playstyle would live on. Soulcalibur III, which only released on the PS2 and in arcades, has the Sword and Shield discipline. This is largely the same moveset, however a few of Link's more iconic moves, including the spin attack and charge, have been removed.
Perhaps one of the most contentious releases on the GameCube was The Legend of Zelda: The Wind Waker. Its cel-shaded graphics may be widely appreciated now, but on reveal, it caused many heads to turn. It's respected as one of the best entries in the series by many these days, and its attention to detail is appreciated. One such detail was discovered in 2016 when an American live streamer known as FishWaffle64 found that the boss of the Forbidden Woods, Kali Demos, can be defeated in a very unique way. Whilst joking with her audience, a user in her live chat suggested that since Kali Demos is a giant plant monster, perhaps it could be watered using the forest water found at Forest Haven. As it turns out, pouring the water onto the monster's exposed flower head will actually defeat the boss quite easily. While this was performed in the HD Wii U version of the game on stream, the folks over at Nintendo Life tested and confirmed that this secret technique can also be performed in the original GameCube release as well. What makes this secret rather interesting is that the forest water will expire after it's been bottled for 30 minutes, which means players would have to collect the water, enter the dungeon, get to the boss, and drop the water within a 30-minute time span, which could be troublesome. That said, it is possible to leave the dungeon after opening the boss room up, collect the water, and then return to the boss. But this is far from Wind Waker's only obscure secret. The game has Hylian text scattered throughout the world, and when translated into English, this text usually gives a fairly straightforward word or two about whatever the text is beside. But occasionally, the Hylian scribe holds some interesting details that you'd have no way of knowing without translating the text. For example, there's a board at the Windfall Island Cafe written in Hylian, which is actually a specials board. When translated, it reads, "Today's specials, Lon Lon Milk 150, Deku Nut Cake 300, Zora Coffee 150. While Lon Lon Milk and Deku Nuts have appeared in various Zelda games, to this day, no Zelda title has ever featured a drink called Zora Coffee. Another secret can be found at Windfall Island. There's a grave on the island that's regularly danced around by Tot. This grave has Hylian text on it which can be read as 831894, to become a great artist, revealing that whoever died was 63 years of age and aspired to be a great artist, appropriately similar to Tot, and from one of Nintendo's biggest franchise to one of their biggest rivals of all time.
The GameCube saw one character appear on a Nintendo system that until recently seemed like an impossibility. Sonic Adventure 1 and 2 were ported from the Dreamcast to the GameCube after Sega's attempt at a next-generation console proved to be too much for the Japanese developer. This didn't mean that the Dreamcast didn't have strong titles of its own, but with Nintendo being a strong leader in the market, Sega saw it fit to release Sonic's latest 3D adventures on their historic rival system. Sonic Adventure 2 Battle was first shown on the system at Nintendo's Space World event 2001, with the game actually hitting the market only a short few months later, December in Japan and early 2002 elsewhere. This port is believed to have had only 6 months of development, with many of its graphical assets and functions tweaked during this short span of time. The Chow Gardens, for instance, had GBAs in place of the original Dreamcast VMUs for players that wanted to take their chow on the go. But when the game was first shown off, there was a slight oversight with these GBAs that Sega fixed in time for launch. The GBA in the Chow Gardens was red, but when Nintendo announced the launch colors for the Game Boy Advance, red wouldn't be an option. In fact, red GBAs wouldn't be available until 2002, with an exclusive limited edition red Target GBA in the United States and a red Zeller's GBA in Canada. The GBAs in the games were quietly changed to resemble the Arctic GBA variant, which was available on launch. Sonic Adventure 2 saw a release on the GameCube before its predecessor, Sonic Adventure DX Director's Cut. This was possibly because the first Sonic Adventure may not have been quite as polished as its sequel. Many players at the time had tried to break Sonic Adventure in order to discover interesting secrets and glitches, and perhaps some hints of differences in earlier builds of the game. While playing as Big the Cat, it's possible to perform an out-of-bounds glitch which can grant him access to the Station Square Hotel prior to clearing the ice cap stage. By glitching into the ocean and hitting a teleport spot to enter the hotel, Big will be prevented from accessing the pool area behind a locked door. In this restricted area, it's possible to find 2 keys which must be placed on pedestals in order to open the pool area, a situation that doesn't occur at any other point. At no stage in the game must the player fit these keys onto the pedestals. It is only by accessing this area before the player is supposed to that this condition is met. meaning that the players may have had to open the pool area before accessing it in some earlier builds during the game's development, before it was decided to just have the pool area open at all times instead.
Now we're going to spend some time talking about the absolutely insane development of Star Wars Rogue Squadron 2 Rogue Leader. Work on the game started in January 2001 and had to be finished in just 9 months so it could release alongside the GameCube. This was about half the time necessary to make the game normally, which meant 6 to 7 day work weeks of constant crunch would be needed. Though Rogue Leader was co-developed by Factor 5 and LucasArts, the bulk of the game's development was done by Factor 5, a team of 25 people plus 2 freelancers. Unfortunately for the team, most obstacles would come. They couldn't use the CG film models of ships made by ILM for the original trilogy, as it wasn't practical to convert them to the polygonal models needed for game development. Instead, usable models were made using Maya. Due to the limited time and resources, some of the models were even made using kids' toys as reference material. An in-house level editing tool called L3D was used for the game's missions, but L3D was an outdated tool made for the original game on N64, and Factor 5 didn't have the time to craft new tools. Roughly half the music for the game is from John Williams' original score, which also saved time. Luckily, Factor 5 had helped develop the Cube's audio system for Nintendo, Musix, and due to their familiarity with the audio tools, they were able to seamlessly blend music dynamically during gameplay, resulting in some of the best audio of the era. This was also partly due to the team adding 5-channel surround sound featuring Dolby Pro Logic 2 tech towards the end of development, making Rogue Leader the first game ever to do so. Another series with a long history of development struggles is Fire Emblem. By the time of Fire Emblem Path of Radiance's release, the series was finally in a position to be well received by English-speaking audiences. The game had a fairly interesting localization into English, with many small alterations being made throughout. In one scene, Ike will recall how he received a harsh scolding from his dad for attempting to reach out and take a medallion from his sister. Some players were curious as to whether the English dialogue was a faithful translation of the original Japanese, and turned to professional translator Cantopia for clarification. Cantopia translated the original paragraph into English, and found that it was almost word for word an accurate interpretation, all except Ike receiving a scolding. In the Japanese game, Ike's dad gave him a, quote, severe beating. This was likely changed due to physical punishment of children being considered a bit more taboo in the West than it is in Japan. It could also be due to ESRB concerns, but this would make some other localization changes in the game seem like very bizarre choices indeed. The localizers actually added multiple profane comments in Marcia's dialogue, and made her generally feistier overall. This includes calling Makalov a brainless eunuch and dungheel. These statements simply don't exist in the Japanese game at all, and were added to the English release.
Path of Radiance was a late arrival to the GameCube, but one of the very last games to be published on the system, and certainly the last published by Nintendo, was The Legend of Zelda: Twilight Princess. This game went through a curious development period, having originally been created for the GameCube, only to be simultaneously ported to the Wii in a cross-generational release. Some of the earliest periods of development reveal some curious choices from the dev team, such as one piece of information revealed by Zelda art director Satoru Takizawa surrounding the earliest experiments with the character of Midna. The creation of Link's adventuring partner in this game went through several iterations, with Takizawa stating, "The challenge started with brainstorming among designers for ideas, and then we eventually finalized this character through a trial and error process for her shape, facial expressions, actions, etc. In early prototypes, as a placeholder for Midna, Tetra from The Legend of Zelda: The Wind Waker was riding on Wolf Link as he ran around Hyrule." While of course this choice of having Tetra's model be used was purely for prototyping, it wouldn't be too far-fetched to think that Tetra's stature may have contributed to the design of Midna in the final game. Other designs in the game were altered dramatically, even when they were intended to appear all along. The Uku in the final game's release take on the appearance of some sort of creepy bird with a human face. But at the time of Twilight Princess HD's release, the official Japanese Zelda Twitter account revealed that originally, the Uku would look more humanoid with bird-like features instead. The final game also has some secrets of its own. Players who've beat the Cave of Ordeals might recall that room 49 contains 3 dark nuts for the player to overcome. However, if the player decides to go through the Cave of Ordeals a second time for whatever reason, they'll find that the cave is slightly more difficult, with the 49th room now having an additional 4th dark nut. This is fascinating and all, but this video has had far too little Mario so far.
Let's fix that. Of course, one of the biggest releases on the GameCube was Mario's tropical outing, where he soaks up the sun in Super Mario Sunshine. This game has been explored inside and out by gaming fans for years, but even still, there's always more to learn about these big Nintendo titles. One Twitter user, Zelpiku Kirby, discovered an interesting trick that we've frankly never even heard of before that could be performed in Pina Park. If the player enters the level and lures a stew to the edge of the water fountain and flips it over with a spray, they can sling it into the Bowser Jr. balloons and pop them. Normally, these balloons can only be popped using the water rockets during the Mecha Bowser roller coaster event. Unfortunately, if the player pops some balloons and then triggers the roller coaster event, the balloons will have respawned. This is likely because the coaster event uses different balloons in slightly different positions. And while Zelpiku Kirby discovered this trick in the Mario 3D All-Stars version of Sunshine on the Switch, another Twitter user demonstrated that this same trick can indeed be performed in the original GameCube release. The game really focuses on the struggles Mario faces as he explores an island covered in goop, but there were clearly more effects to this goop than would be faced by the plumber during development, but which were removed prior to the game's final publication. An unused goop effect can be found in the game's files that, when Mario jumps into it, will cause him to sink like it was quicksand and take damage. This effect causes Mario to perform unique struggling animations and voice clips that are not found anywhere in the final game, suggesting that this goop variant was cut late into development.
It's been about a year since last time we did an extra on GameCube games, so what better place to refamiliarize ourselves than one of Nintendo's own offerings, which also happens to be the best-selling GameCube game ever, Super Smash Bros. Melee. The game had an impressive amount of content for the time, and a lot of material had to be altered between different regional releases. This not only led to mistakes, but also some use of artistic license. The name behind the Poker Float stage was itself born out of the localization process. The Japanese version of Melee refers to the stage as Pokemon Subspace, and the Pokemon are not implied to be balloons at all. Subspace was used in other Nintendo games like Super Mario Bros. 2 to mean a world that exists in an alternate dimension, usually with different rules. So the idea of the Pokemon being balloons was something that was completely made up by the game's English localization team, and wasn't the original intention. As an interesting aside, most of the Pokemon in the stage are ones that can actually be summoned through the Pokeball item in Melee, with the exception of one key Pokemon, Onix. It's unknown if Onix was originally planned to be summonable in Melee, but it's worth pointing out that Onix was summonable in Smash on the N64. Another notable stage name change that occurred during Melee's localization was the unlockable Mario 64 base stage called Rainbow Ride. The Japanese title is Rainbow Cruise, as the stage is closer to the ground than the stage it references from Super Mario 64. While the Rainbow Ride title would go on to be used in the North American release of Melee, the title Rainbow Cruise was used in the PAL version, leading to differences across the regions. The name would be contested again in Brawl, but notably, all English versions of Ultimate use Rainbow Cruise across all regions, thus cementing the US version of the title as the stage's official name in English. One GameCube game that saw significant changes from its inception was one of the system's fan favorites, Luigi's Mansion. Although we've spoken about this game a handful of times before, there's some secrets we've yet to discuss. In an interview with Luigi's Mansion director Hideki Kono described some aspects of the game's original direction. The game was originally going to be set around a big house or even apartment complex, but this was switched up and the setting became something like a dollhouse. The team started experimenting with Mario characters being on a TV set using a dollhouse backdrop, and eventually shifted the focus onto Luigi. There was an idea to set the game within a ninja mansion or Japanese-style house, but the team ultimately decided to settle settle on a European-style building, which was also reminiscent of some older mansions in the United States. There were also prairie and desert areas in the game when it was using a generic Mario theme, but these were cut when the mansion idea took hold. As soon as the mansion concept was decided, the blueprint of the house, a 3-story structure with a basement, was already set in stone, and the design conversation became about how to keep the mansion varied. The team put a huge staircase in the lobby, a bathroom on each floor, a training room, and a music room, all to make sure the mansion had a Western feel. Another idea that was cut was for an underground cave to extend the geographical environment. And the game even had an RPG-inspired system which upgraded stages after certain actions. But this was cut so that the team could focus on the vacuum mechanics. Another beloved Mario game on the Cube is Paper Mario: The Thousand Year Door. And again, we briefly covered some of the game's out-of-bounds secrets in a Paper Mario video we did not too long ago, but we neglected to mention quite an interesting off-screen tidbit. It seems that within Thousand Year Door, for some unseen reason, Mario, Peach, and Bowser have crucial code attached to them that the game needs to have loaded at all times. So much so that if a scene in the game doesn't have one of these characters present, it will break. The title's designers circumvent this limitation by having Mario, Peach, or Bowser out of the camera's view if they aren't actively taking part in the scene. This is even true of the game's introduction, where Mario can be found by pulling the camera back to about 20% zoom. The same can be said for the scenes of Sir Grodus talking to his henchmen, where Peach will be about the same distance out of shot to the south. Yet another GameCube Mario title that has some interesting secrets is Mario Golf Toadstool Tour. This is one of the few Mario games that actually released in North America before Japan, meaning the Japanese version of the game has a fair amount of improvements over the Western release. In Japan, the game is known as Mario Golf Family Tour and features many small changes that you might expect, such as measuring putting distances and wind speed in meters and meters per second instead of feet and miles per hour. There are also several font changes, and the colors were tweaked for messages like nice shot and excellent. The most significant improvement, however, was a coding overhaul on how things in the game are processed. CPU characters calculate their shots a lot faster than in the American release, and cycle through clubs faster as well. Various menu transitions also move much more quickly. A few oversights were also corrected from the American release, such as the hole-in-ones on par 4 and par 5 holes being mistakenly announced as an albatross. For some reason, the method of unlocking the ace-level CPU player difficulty was made different in every region. In the original American release, it's unlocked by beating every star tournament a single time with every non-star character. This meant that players had to win 102 star tournaments, which was honestly a bit too much work for the reward. In Japan, all the player had to do was beat Bowser in his character match. And in Europe, players just had to win the Bowser Star Championship. One more GameCube gem that has what you might call unnecessary regional changes is Baten Kaitos, Eternal Wings and the Lost Ocean. Baten Kaitos has a unique setting and a fairly unique combat system to boot. It utilizes a turn-based, card-based system that uses magical cards known as Magnus, which absorb the essence of real-world objects. These cards containing items and objects can then be used in battle. Interestingly, 28 of the cards are changed in the international release, likely to make the purpose of the cards more clear to Westerners. And although some make perfect sense, like swapping out obscure Japanese dumplings for shish kebab, some seem a bit pointless. One that stands out the most to us is swapping out edamame beans for peanuts, instead of just renaming the card Beans. From one turn-based RPG to another, Pokemon XD Gale of Darkness was a hit amongst fans, but is scarcely talked about these days, likely due to its releasing towards the end of the GameCube's lifespan. This is a shame, because as well as being a great game, it has a decent amount of interesting tidbits. When players start their adventure in Pokemon XD, they set out with just a level 10 EV. However, there is evidence in the code that this isn't always what the developers had planned. Using action replay codes, it's possible to swap out the level 5 Eevee for 2 starter Pokemon, a level 26 Jolteon and a level 30 Vaporeon, which are within the game's code. This would have lined up quite well with Pokemon Colosseum, where players started out with a level 25 Espeon and a level 26 Umbreon. This also has other implications. Since these two starters are nearly 20 levels higher than Eevee, the levels of Pokemon throughout the entire game would have been proportionately higher as well. And that's not all. The game has another unused Pokemon of sorts. The Pokemon Bonsly was first introduced in XD as part of the game's story, but wasn't a truly playable Pokemon. However, Bonsly can be added to the player's party through hacking and will be fully functional. The only setback is that Bonsly can't evolve into Sudowoodo, likely because it was never expected to be possible in the first place. Another game with a cult following for the Cube is Animal Crossing. As you might recall, the title had a handful of emulated NES titles that could be played by obtaining in-game items, which are essentially NES consoles with unchangeable cartridges inside them. There's also a generic NES console item with no cartridge inside that can be purchased from Red. This item was originally thought to be unplayable and purely decorative, as it would display the message, "I want to play my NES, but I don't have any software," when the player interacted with it. However, it was recently discovered that this item actually scans the GameCube's memory card for special files that contain NES ROMs. Security researcher James Chambers found the unique feature while searching through Animal Crossing's code, messing around with the debug menus and seeing how various items function. Chambers experimented with the feature and was eventually able to use it to play Mega Man, Pinball, and Battletoads off his GameCube memory card through the in-game emulator. Although the function may simply be a leftover from testing, it's speculated by some that Nintendo were planning to use this feature to distribute NES games. Nintendo could have sold preloaded memory cards full of NES ROMs, or even given them away as prizes. There's actually some precedent for this, as Nintendo sold versions of Animal Crossing packaged with memory cards that unlocked unique items for players. And now for possibly the most cult title on our list, having sold fewer than an estimated 390,000 copies, it's Chibi-Robo. The game was originally being developed by Just Skip and not Nintendo, but it was still intended for a GameCube release. The game's storyline back then was different. You needed to train Chibi-Robo to get home and avoid the burglars that were after him. The gameplay was going to be similar to a point-and-click adventure. Early videos show Chibi-Robo in a lab of some sort, running around trying to collect batteries to raise his own internal battery. It seems that Chibi-Robo would have also been able to evolve itself, as we can see from Robo upgrades in one of the concept arts. There were also other beta activities like pushing things over, moving objects, and other ideas to get batteries and other things. However, after a few years, Skip gave up on the project. Nintendo, though, was still interested in the idea of the game and saved it from development hell by building on Skip's project. Nintendo reworked the engine into its current action-adventure style, gave it new environments and a new storyline.
Did you know? Instead of using a magical conductor's baton, Link was originally planned to control the wind using a theremin. This alien-sounding instrument was accidentally invented by a Soviet radio engineer in 1920. Leon Theremin was trying to make something else entirely, but ended up with the world's first major electronic instrument. Instead of touching it, the musician leaves their hands floating above it. One hand controls the frequency, and the other controls the amplitude. But how exactly did this almost get into a Zelda game? A movie about Leon Theremin had just come out in Japan, about how he invented the instrument, traveled the world playing it, became a Soviet spy, and got thrown in the gulags. And it turns out that a few Nintendo devs saw the movie and thought, hey, that's an interesting story, let's have Link play a theremin in the next Zelda game. To control the instrument, players would have held their GameCube controller like this, with the analog and C sticks each representing one of Link's hands playing the theremin. The game's title comes from the primary instrument, so up until halfway into development, the theremin itself was the Wind Waker. This was all explained by the game's director Eiji Aonuma in a 2003 issue of Nintendo Dream we recently had translated, and they joke that the game could have been called The Legend of Zelda, The Wind Theremin. For this video, we delved into hundreds of magazines looking for cut content and obscure facts about the Wind Waker, and ended up translating several magazines and some online interviews into English for the first time. We want to keep going the extra mile to get new and interesting facts for you guys, and if you want to see more of it too, leave a like on this video. It really helps us out. So anyway, Aonuma and his team were all set with a Zelda game based around a theremin, Then Shigeru Miyamoto came in for playtesting and, as he tends to do, upended the tea table. According to Aonuma, he'd play what we made and point out what was weird. We had the Wind Waker item ready to some extent when Miyamoto came to me shaking his head saying no, no, no. He talked about how it was entirely unacceptable. We were using both sticks at first, adjusting with both hands like how you play a theremin. By moving both hands like this, then the magazine notes that Aonuma aims his palms down and moves his hands up and down, you could change the sound. But eventually we changed it to the baton, and everything else fell into place from there. By the way, a big thanks to Daniel Romberger for making this demonstration for us, so we can see and hear a theremin in action. Check out his channel for more Nintendo remixes. Miyamoto also changed Wind Waker's difficulty. It was initially harder, but a lot of Ocarina and Majora players got stuck on bosses and never got to experience the full game. So, to make sure everyone could reach the ending, Miyamoto toned down the difficulty, especially the bosses, compared to how the Zelda team originally had it set. When the HD remaster released a decade later, they added Hero Mode to compensate. But Aonuma said even though he's the director, this new mode was too hard even for him. He got stuck on Goma and gave up, then asked his team if the difficulty he was experiencing was some sort of bug, and they were like, no. Another aspect that Miyamoto wasn't keen on was Wind Waker's art style. Initially, Nintendo was just going to improve on the graphics from Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask, and they even built a prototype in that style. But later on in the conceptual phase, the Zelda team's artist proposed Toon Link. The rest of the team loved it, and dove headfirst into the cel-shaded art style. Aonuma didn't think Miyamoto would like it, so he waited till they were already in pretty deep to show it to him. And he was right. Miyamoto literally cringed, and didn't think it would sell. Aonuma recalls, "If I had gone and talked to him from the very beginning, I think he would have said, 'How is that Zelda?' Miyamoto had trouble letting go of the realistic Link art style until the very end. At some point, he had to give a presentation against his will. That's when he said something to me like, 'You know, it's not too late to change course and make a realistic Zelda.' But the team was super enthusiastic about the new style and insisted they didn't want to give it up. It was inspired by the anime they watched as kids, especially Hayao Miyazaki's Animal Treasure Island. And Aonuma says Wind Waker's kind of unique in the way it doesn't feel like a Zelda game. It's more of an adventure across the sea where the main character just happens to be Link. And for that reason, the story was also kept from Miyamoto for quite a long time. Miyamoto really wasn't thrilled with the situation, but ultimately accepted it because with the team they had, it would have taken 10 years to make a realistic Zelda, but a Toon Zelda could be made in a fraction of the time. Most other Zelda titles make you feel like you're Link, but in Wind Waker, the team tried to make it feel more like you're guiding Link, almost as if you're watching an anime. In other words, he's his own entity outside the player's inputs. This separation was emphasized with Link's eyes. He looks around independently of the player's actions and what the player sees. In early builds shown to the public, Link's eyes were solid black, but a fan from Europe sent in a letter saying black eyes made Europeans uncomfortable. In response, Miyamoto said, "His eyes would change between 7 different colors. We made it so his eyes were temporarily red in battle, then blue when he calms down, and green when he's talking to people, and things like that. But ultimately we realized a human with red eyes is kind of creepy, isn't it? So at that point we just decided to give up on the idea." Ultimately, they looked at Mario's blue eyes and said, "Let's just make Link's eyes blue and call it a day." Fan letters continued pouring in, especially from girls asking to get rid of the Toon Link altogether. Lots of girls demanded in no uncertain terms that they bring back the stud from Ocarina, the teenage heartthrob they fell in love with 5 years earlier, but Nintendo ignored them. Wind Waker's timeline placement changed as well. Miyamoto said they initially placed it at the very beginning, before the other Zelda games, but shortly after release, Aonuma said they'd changed it to take place 100 years after Ocarina of Time, a fact reflected in the game's story. Probably the biggest changes in development were for the sea itself. According to Aonuma, we wanted to do away with the Hyrule we'd had so far. We didn't want to just remake the same Hyrule from the N64, so what could we do? How about we just sync the whole thing? At first, we had plans for primary and alternate worlds like A Link to the Past, where you could go back and forth between present and past Hyrule, but we couldn't make something like that in the limited time we had. In A Link to the Past, you can warp back and forth between the light world, where most of the game takes place, and a dark, twisted version of Hyrule called the Dark World. Wind Waker would have used a similar mechanic, but instead of the Dark World, Link would have explored underwater Hyrule. This concept art in the Hyrule Historia gives us a better look at how they were thinking that might have worked, with Link using a key item to warp down to the lower world. To get back to the upper world, Link would have grabbed onto hooks belonging to fishermen who'd yank him up back to the surface. Wind Waker spent 1 year in the planning stages, which gave them time to decide which parts of the Great Sea lined up with parts of Ocarina's Hyrule, but Nintendo only gave them 1.5 years in actual production. So unfortunately, the team simply didn't have enough time to fully implement their ideas, and the only underwater location they could include was Hyrule Castle. They also wanted to make the ocean a lot smaller, but according to Aonuma, part of the reason the sea's so vast is because if we made it smaller, there wouldn't be enough time to process the data for whatever island you were heading towards. We had to strike a good balance with the boat's speed for the same reason. In the middle of development, we wanted to make the boat go faster, but doing that meant the game couldn't read all the data, and it froze a lot. As a result, the ocean ended up bigger than they wanted, and some fans thought getting from island to island took too long, which is why they eventually added a swift sail in the HD remaster. In the final game, if you reach the edge of the ocean, the boat says you can't go any farther and forces you to U-turn. But the Zelda team originally thought of making the ocean continuous to simulate the world being round, like how the world works in Skies of Arcadia, a Dreamcast game that launched while Wind Waker was in its planning stage. That way, if you sail off the right side of the map, you'd suddenly appear on the left side, or if you keep going up, you'll come out at the bottom. But they ended up scrapping that idea for story purposes. Wind Waker was brand new when this magazine interview took place, so the developers didn't want to reveal too much about the plot. But they did say you'll understand why they didn't make the world round when you see the game's ending. They're probably alluding to Wind Waker's final moments, when Link and Zelda sail off into the distance, looking for a land that'll become the next Hyrule. If the game's ocean was round and continuous, that would have implied the game world was in the entire world, meaning Link and Zelda would never find the land they were looking for. In other words, a cool gameplay concept was scrapped for the sake of the story. Speaking of Wind Waker's ending, a direct sequel was originally planned for GameCube, which would have seen Toon Link riding a horse around on the Great Plains. So it seems Link and Tetra would have discovered the land they were looking for, but Wind Waker's sales fell so far below expectations that Nintendo decided to make Twilight Princess instead. Ubisoft staff also tried making a Wind Waker sequel for Game Boy Advance, but the project got canned after just 1 month. And in 2007, Aonuma said he wanted to make a new Wind Waker for Wii, but knew he wouldn't be able to swing it, presumably due to the disappointing sales of the original. Toon Link did eventually get a couple more adventures on Nintendo DS, but there was actually one more game with Toon Link that did get made, but never came to the West. Tetra's Trackers was a GameCube spin-off game released in 2004. The story picks up right where Wind Waker left off, with Link now trying to prove he's got what it takes to join Tetra's crew and become a bona fide pirate. It was announced at E3 2003, and was originally planned for worldwide release as a standalone GameCube game, but during the last year of development, it got shrunk down and included with Four Swords Adventures, but only in the Japanese and Korean versions of the game. There it was called Navi Trackers, but since the English title was announced as Tetra's Trackers, that's what we're gonna call it. Tetra's Trackers was never localized into any other languages, probably because it would have been difficult with the game's full voice acting. Have a listen and you'll see what we mean. Tetra's Trackers never even got a fan translation, so we translated parts of it and added subtitles for use in this video. And it didn't just feature Tetra. A huge cast of Wind Waker characters make an appearance, and they talk constantly. Even minor characters like Sue Bell from Outset Island. The sploosh guy Salvatore has his own voice, and also does some impressions. But probably the most disconcerting voice comes from the King of Red Lions. We won't go over all the characters, but there's a lot of them, which would have made localizing Tetra's Trackers pretty tricky. And since it had already been relegated to just being a part of Four Swords, it probably wouldn't have been all that profitable. So how does the game actually work? In Four Swords Adventures, you plug up to 4 Game Boy Advances into your GameCube. Most of the gameplay takes place on the TV screen, and occasionally look down at their GBA screen if they go into a house or something. But in Tetris Trackers, most of the gameplay takes place on the GBA, and you occasionally look up at the TV to see the map or other miscellaneous information. It's basically a treasure hunting party game. Each player, represented by a different colored Link, runs through maze-like stages searching for pirates, stamps, medals, seashells, rupees. Everything's worth a certain number of points, and whoever's got the most points after 9 minutes wins. There's also a single-player mode where you compete against Tingle. That's the short explanation. It'd probably take 15 minutes to explain it all in depth, and there's some development background as well, so we'll save that for a future video. Make sure and subscribe if you don't want to miss it. But for the purpose of today's video, besides the funny voices and visuals, we also wanted to point out that Tetris Trackers fits into the Zelda timeline right here. It's Link's initiation into Tetra's gang of pirates, right between Wind Waker and Phantom Hourglass. But whether or not it's considered canon is controversial among fans, especially after it got bundled with Four Swords Adventures, which stars another Link who lives in a different timeline. Four Swords definitely is canon, but since there's 2 Links on one disc, and Tetris Trackers only released in Japanese, some fans refuse to acknowledge it. But even the developers don't think too much about the timeline and what is or isn't canon, so trying to find a definitive answer is probably overthinking it. Either way, it's certainly an interesting chapter in the life and times of Toon Link. Okay, let's get back to those magazines we translated. The whole staff talks about how glad they were to finally finish Wind Waker and how much crunch was required to get the game out on time. Looking back right after launch, they said, "It was painful when we were making it. We really couldn't go home or see our kids. When everyone came into work in the morning, I'd move from where I slept on the 3rd floor to my workstation on the 5th floor, and then go back to the 3rd floor at night. I had no idea what was happening in the outside world." Aonuma wasn't even aware winter had arrived, adding, "I saw some guys in the office wearing down jackets and thought, what's up with these guys? When I eventually got to go home, I was surprised to see how cold it had gotten." Even with all that crunch, Wind Waker's short 1.5-year development meant they just didn't have enough time to include everything they would have liked. Aonuma says the very last thing they were working on when the clock struck midnight was the crabs. In the final game, they're tiny and don't really do anything except run away and dig into the sand. But the Zelda team wanted to make them 10 times their normal size and much more interactive. Nintendo Dream Magazine makes a point of Aonuma's regretful tone as he tells them, "We were going to have crabs on the shore and do lots of things with them, but in the end we couldn't make it happen. We were thinking about what to do with the crabs when development ended. Sorry about the crabs." He also laments how the boat turned out. In the final game, if you're on the boat, equipping the bombs makes a cannon appear, and the grapple hook turns into a crane for dredging up treasure. But Aonuma says they wanted to add a lot more tools for the boat, but didn't have enough time. They probably could have implemented at least one more, if it wasn't for one guy on the Zelda team who vastly overestimated the American education system. Aonuma said, "I've never sailed a ship before, and I thought sailboats couldn't move against the direction of the wind. But someone who's actually been on a yacht told me, if a boat zigzags, it can still sail against the wind." Which was the first I'd ever heard of that. I was told, this is something everyone in America learns in high school, and if you don't get it right, there are definitely going to be complaints. So I thought we couldn't cut corners there. The extra time spent on the zigzagging boat meant less time was left for other items. Previous Zelda games always had a nice variety of mini-games, like the shooting gallery and bomb chew bowling. The team wanted to add some into Wind Waker too, like an island where Link can play golf. Unfortunately though, time was so tight that Aonuma had to give the order to abandon the idea. But as they were nearing the deadline, they came into the office one morning and were shocked to see the golf island somehow appeared out of nowhere. Aonuma said someone must have snuck in after hours and built it themselves, without anyone else on the team knowing. Sadly though, a lot of other mini-games weren't so lucky, and along with 2 entire dungeons, ultimately got left out of the final game. One thing that did make it in was the Sploosh game on Windfall Island, which was demanded by Nintendo's old-timers, which kinda makes sense since it's based on Battleship, an old board game that boomers played when they were kids. Aonuma even had to ban the strategy guide team from playing it because he was afraid they'd get obsessed and never get around to playing the rest of the game. In the original Japanese version, Salvatore's game is literally about sinking battleships. But when Wind Waker was localized for an international audience, they changed it into a squid game. And when the HD remaster released a decade later, they used the squid version in every region, including Japan. But these aren't the only secrets we dug up on Wind Waker. According to Aonuma and Haruhana, the Deku Leaf was originally a paper fan. Its only purpose was fanning things, but later in development they came up with the idea for Link to use it to fly around in the wind, so they changed it into a leaf. If you ever wondered how deep underwater old Hyrule was, Aonuma provides an answer in one of these magazines. He says, "We limited the sense of how deep it is because of the crane. It's fairly easy to go to Hyrule as well. It's deep enough to fully hide a person, and then a little deeper still." He might be referring to its canonical depth and not its actual depth though, because in his Boundary Break episode, YouTuber She Says moved the camera to get a visual of the depth, which made it look to be around 40 feet. The only part of Hyrule you actually get to visit is the castle, which is definitely deeper than both those estimates, but that's probably because it's at the bottom of a chasm. Another interesting fact is that every item in Wind Waker had its name translated in Wind Waker's English release, except for one, the Hioi pear. As pointed out by Aonuma in one of these magazines, the fruit gets its name from hioi, the Japanese word for possession, as in being possessed like how a spirit takes control of a person's body. So if they translated the hioi pear, it would have been the possession pear, which apparently they didn't think the Western audience could handle. Well, probably the Western audience's parents, if you know what I mean. One of the younger devs, Toshiaki Suzuki, was selected as Wind Waker's, quote, Tingle specialist. Working on Tingle and his fairy buddies was his entire job for quite some time. One of his coworkers said, "From dusk till dawn, he thought about nothing but Tingle. It drove him crazy." In all these magazines, Toshiaki's only given one brief opportunity to speak, which he uses to say, "I've been thinking about nothing but Tingle for these last few months, so please, experience adventuring together with Tingle. The rare blue Tingle is on Outset Island, ... What he's talking about is the rarest character in the whole game, and most people who've played Wind Waker never even knew he existed. Knuckle is Tingle's little brother. He carved the entirety of Tingle Tower by himself when he was just 10 years old. Then Tingle came along and put up a sign that said "For Tingle Only," which made Knuckle so mad that he ran away to Outlet Island. The only way you can ever see Knuckle in the GameCube version is by plugging in a Game Boy Advance and going to Outset, which triggers an argument between the two fairy brothers. Then you play a mini-game to unlock the hand-me-down Tingle Tuner, an item only found in the GameCube version that lets you buy arrows, bombs, and bait anytime you want through the GBA. Finding Knuckle is such a hassle that the game actually considers your figurine collection complete if you manage to get all of them except Knuckle. Speaking of Knuckle's figurine, its description features an interesting secret. It says his studio is inside the head of Tingle Tower. It's impossible to get inside the tower's head through any normal means, but it is possible if you hack the game, and by the looks of it, it seems the Tingle specialist really did go crazy. Just look at this place. Since the HD remaster couldn't hook up with a Game Boy Advance, most of Knuckles' content got cut. The argument, the minigame, and even the hand-me-down Tingle Tuner he gives you. But he will appear on Tingle Island after you get the 5 Tingle statues, and Knuckles' figure now is required to complete the full collection. It's been updated to say, supposedly it used to bother him that this collection was considered complete, even without his figurine. And if you're worried about that Tingle specialist who went crazy, don't worry. Things worked out pretty well for him. He immediately got promoted to director and made Four Swords Adventures, and nowadays he's producer on the Mario Party series. Did you know? There were over 100 games planned to release on the GameCube that were canceled before seeing the light of day. Ever wondered what they were or why they were canceled? In this video, we'll be covering all of them, with a few exceptions. Certain games will be left out, such as games that were rumored to exist but have no solid evidence backing them, such as Croc 3, and games that were announced for GameCube but released on rival platforms or next-gen platforms, such as Crash Twinsanity or Super Paper Mario. Since we're talking GameCube, we'll start with a few of Nintendo's own scrapped projects. Kirby Tilt and Tumble 2 was first revealed at Space World 2001. It used a Game Boy Advance as a controller, with a special motion-sensing cartridge that let players tilt the controller to change Kirby's direction and speed. Outlets reported players could move between the TV and the GBA screen, and that Shigeru Miyamoto said players could write their own programs on the game cartridges, such as creating mini-games for themselves and their friends to play. In 2002, the game was rebranded as Roll-O-Rama, with Kirby being removed altogether. Roll-O-Rama was showcased at E3 2002, but never released. But this wasn't the only Kirby game that ran into trouble, not by a long shot. Over the course of 11 years, there were 3 separate attempts to make a mainline Kirby game for the GameCube. The first was a 2.5D title with 4-player gameplay. A reason for its cancellation wasn't given, though Shigefumi Kawase, the producer of Kirby's Return to Dreamland, said the game was when he learned how difficult it is to make a game that is both multiplayer and single player. The second game would have been the Kirby series' first ever 3D platformer. It was cancelled because it hadn't reached the level of quality Nintendo wanted. The third game featured a 2D art style similar to a pop-up book and powered up versions of the copy abilities from previous games. Satoru Iwata, who once headed the studio involved in making these games, commented on the 11 years of development, stating, "Miyamoto says that video games are something you never really complete. It's hard when a game simply refuses to come together." All 3 games are collectively referred to by fans as Kirby GCN, Kirby Adventure, or Kirby Legend of the Stars. Though various elements from all 3 of these games found their way into Kirby's Return to Dreamland for the Wii and a few other titles, none of these projects received a true reworking into a new game. Rather, Nintendo considers Kirby's Return to Dreamland the successor to Kirby GCN. Another scrapped title was the mysterious Marionette. This was an unusual Nintendo game accidentally announced alongside Super Mario Sunshine and the Mario 128 tech demo. Shortly after the erroneous listing was published, it was quietly taken down. Despite having Mario in the title and being listed alongside other Mario titles, Marionette wasn't a Mario game. As Miyamoto later told IGN, the game was about controlling a puppet. It aimed to be simple, but also complicated. Marionette had been in development for both the Nintendo 64 and the GameCube, but never got past its initial stages. Miyamoto later commented there was a possibility the game could resurface on the Wii, but it never appeared. Retro Studios, the team behind Metroid Prime, had a series of titles that were cancelled around the time they were first acquired by Nintendo. The game Action Adventure was one of the first projects Retro ever undertook. The game featured 3 female leads fighting evil in a post-apocalyptic planet set in the near future, with a sci-fi setting. Due to the concept, some have speculated aspects of this game were reworked into Metroid Prime. However, this speculation is unfounded. What Action Adventure did do, though, was give Nintendo enough confidence in Retro to let them handle the Metroid franchise. Once the Metroid license was in Retro's hands, the studio terminated the Action Adventure project. Thunder Rally Car Battle was a Retro Studios game described by IGN as a mix between Twisted Metal 2 and Mario Kart 64, set in a bleak Mad Max-like world. It was also known as Car Battle and Car Combat while being developed. Another was Retro Studios Football, also known as NFL Retro Football, which, believe it or not, was originally going to be a Mario football game. But Nintendo wanted Retro to make more mature titles, so the project became a realistic sports title before being scrapped entirely. And finally, there was Raven Blade. Retro began work on Raven Blade in late 1999 as a role-playing game for the GameCube. It was first unveiled at E3 2001 with a full trailer. Raven Blade was a third-person action RPG set in an ancient world, featuring an epic quest involving the aforementioned magical weapon, the Raven Blade. In the end, all 4 of these games were cancelled so Retro could fully focus on Metroid. Metroid was Nintendo's top priority, so it became Retro Studios' top priority as well. Given there were rumors Nintendo was looking to buy out the company, Raven Blade may have also been cancelled as a show of commitment to Nintendo. If so, the gamble paid off, as Nintendo purchased $1 million of Retro Studios stock in 2002, making it the majority holder and officially making Retro Studios one of its subsidiaries. Retro weren't the only studio clamoring to make a game using Nintendo's IP. One pitch that never panned out was a sequel to Diddy Kong Racing. Around April 2004, Climax Studios pitched the potential sequel to Nintendo. The game, Diddy Kong Racing Adventures, would have seen WizPig propose a rematch against Diddy and his friends, with his goal being to pave over a forest. The game would have taken the player through 16 different villages styled after characters from the Donkey Kong Country series. Each village would be controlled by a different villain who must be beaten in a race. Vehicles would have included buggies, quad bikes, planes, hover bikes, and jet skis, some of which could be upgraded to access new areas. But this wasn't the only attempt at a Diddy Kong Racing sequel. Donkey Kong Kong Racing made its only appearance at E3 2001 with a trailer featuring Donkey Kong, Diddy Kong, Tiny Kong, Kiddy Kong, and Taj the Genie as playable racers. While not in the trailer, Cranky and Lanky Kong were also shown in an internal render for the game. The overworld would have featured jungles, plains, and seas stitched together seamlessly just like Diddy Kong Racing. It also would have had 4-player multiplayer, and animals from Donkey Kong Country would stand in for vehicles, each with a unique ability. Players could be knocked from their animal, triggering a button-mashing frenzy to get back onto it. The animal could also be upgraded through collectible fruits. During development of the game, Microsoft bought Rare, so Donkey Kong Racing was renamed Saberman Stampede. The game would star Rare's Saberman character and release on the original Xbox, then the Xbox 360 before being cancelled. This cancellation was due to Cameo, Elements of Power, being behind schedule. The Saberman team was relocated and the title was put on hold. In 2008, a video of the 360 prototype was posted on YouTube, showing that Saberman Stampede had evolved from a racer into an adventure game during its ill-fated development. Another popular franchise from Rare is the Conker series. After Conker's Bad Fur Day was released in early 2001, the developers started work on a sequel for the GameCube. The game was called Conker's Other Bad Day, and focused on Conker's unsuccessful tenure as king. The plot saw Conker spending all the kingdom's money on beer and hookers, with the first level featuring Conker breaking out of jail for his crimes. The main villain was a massive space poo, the Cthulhu, and the game featured many parodies of the era's movies. There was even an evil doppelganger of Conker. After attempting to sell Rare to Nintendo in the early 2000s, the company was successfully sold to Microsoft in September 2002. Most of Rare's in-development games were moved to the Xbox. Unfortunately for Conker's Other Bad Day, Microsoft wasn't interested in a Conker sequel. Instead, Microsoft had Rare remake the first Conker game with a multiplayer mode, now known as Conker Live and Reloaded. By the time Rare resumed work on Conker's Other Bad Day, the Xbox was reaching the end of its life cycle. Microsoft wanted Rare to move the game to the upcoming Xbox 360, but to Chris Seaver, the lead developer on the game, this was a bad move. In an interview with Eurogamer, Seaver remembers, "I just couldn't face spending another 2 years on a game we'd already spent a year and a half on, so I guess the cancellation was probably my fault." Rare had also worked on a multiplayer-focused Conker game titled Gettin' Medieval, which reused some assets from Conker's Other Bad Day, and would also feature Greg the Grim Reaper as the protagonist. But those weren't the only projects designed by Seaver to get canned. The mixed fantasy MMO Quest allegedly started sometime after Perfect Dark released on the Nintendo 64. It initially started being developed for the GameCube, but moved to Xbox after Microsoft's acquisition of Rare. By that time, the setting of Quest had transformed into a sci-fi MMO shooter. Development was slow, and Microsoft wanted Rare to focus more on its high-profile franchises like Perfect Dark and Conker. Rare was restructured for that purpose, and Quest was put on hold. Then, after Perfect Dark Zero was released, the original fantasy MMO concept of the game came back into development, this time titled Cascade. But Cascade 2 was cancelled. This was due to the team focusing their work on GoldenEye 007 for the Xbox Live Arcade, a game that also never released. Although not developed by Rare, the next game is related to the studio. In 1998, former Rare developer Martin Hollis of GoldenEye and Perfect Dark fame founded his own studio, Zunami. One of their projects was Game Zero, also known as Project Z3796WP, a GameCube exclusive developed in collaboration with Nintendo in 2000. Game Zero was never shown publicly, but that didn't stop rumors from spreading as soon as the deal was known. Due to Hollis's history, many assumed Game Zero would be another FPS. However, Hollis wanted to try something new. Game Zero was actually a sandbox platformer with destructible voxel levels. In it, a female protagonist mined an alien planet to craft new items and structures, and rescued characters from tightly packed Mario 64-like levels. The game has since been compared to Minecraft, and it's easy to see why. Game Zero's concept was truly ahead of its time, perhaps too far ahead. The destruction and recreation of the voxels used in the game as building blocks was too RAM-intensive for the GameCube, or even PCs to run it properly. Thus, after 3 years of work, Game Zero was quietly dropped. Another scrapped Nintendo-related title came from developer Camelot. The project was in the planning stages as an unnamed RPG in early 2001. Originally, Camelot said they would work on a GameCube RPG as soon as they finished Golden Sun on the GBA. This led to years of rumors that a Golden Sun title would be made for the GameCube. Then, in 2005, a Camelot Help Wanted ad appeared in Famitsu magazine, reading, "Now seeking staff for development of an RPG targeting a next-generation system," leading some to believe the project was moved to the Wii. However, nothing ever seemed to come of it. Nintendo also struck a few deals with prominent third-party developers. The Capcom 5 were 5 GameCube exclusives meant to be developed and published by Capcom to show off the system's friendliness to third-party platforms. Dead Phoenix, ironically, is the only one that didn't make it. It was first revealed in November 2002, but was removed from Capcom's website after failing to appear at E3 2003. Despite this, rumors of its eventual release were common. IGN even hypothesized it was being remade into a Kid Icarus game, but Capcom has historically refused to comment on the possibility of reviving Dead Phoenix. Seeming to confirm its abandonment, the trademark for the game's name was listed as abandoned at the US Patent and Trademark Office in 2004. This wasn't the only high-profile third-party game to be scrapped. Sega and Overworks were confirmed to be planning a sequel to Skies of Arcadia in June 2001, shortly after the original game was released. Sadly, the original Dreamcast game sold extremely poorly. Worried that the game would be a write-off, Sega tried to make PS2 and GameCube ports to make back some money. The GameCube port came out in 2002 and unfortunately also sold poorly. The PS2 port was ultimately dropped. Then in 2003, Overworks were absorbed into Sega WoW. A year later, the team was split even further by a company restructuring, scattering the Arcadia developers into different teams. A ray of hope came in March 2004 when it was acknowledged a Skies of Arcadia sequel was being planned. Then, those hopes were crushed, as in late 2004, Arcadia's producer told German Maniac magazine the sequel was on hold. Nothing on Skies of Arcadia 2 has been announced to date. Another prominent developer, From Software, was also planning an RPG for the GameCube. Gold Star Mountain was a game about capturing, training, and battling monsters. The game's world design was reportedly inspired by Disneyland's various attractions. It was planned to be released in 2002 as a GameCube exclusive. Despite substantial work being done on the game, it was cancelled without explanation. There were many more games that were sad to say never came to fruition. Developed and planned to be published by Midway Games, Crank the Weasel was first revealed at E3 in May 2002. It appeared to be inspired by 1930s American cartoons, with an adult comedic edge in the vein of Conker's Bad Fur Day. Crank would steal things from people and trade them in at pawn shops for cash. He could turn gangs against one another as well, with the ultimate goal of taking over the entire city himself. Humorously, Crank could also rabidly bite and infect a character, which would unleash a frenzied chain reaction of animal biting across the entire level, all set to the tune of Benny Hill's famous theme. The game was intended to be released on GameCube, PS2, and Xbox. While it was cancelled in 2003, a prototype demo and its developer environment was leaked in 2017. Another studio with a cancelled GameCube offering is Acclaim Entertainment. Acclaim began work on a sequel to Turok Evolution sometime after the game's release in 2002. However, the project never truly got off the ground, with only small bits of concept art left to prove it ever existed. Acclaim went bankrupt in 2005, and with it vanished any chance of a direct sequel to Turok Evolution. The series didn't surface again until Propaganda Games released Turok in 2008 for the Xbox 360, PlayStation 3, and PC. iNinja 2, a sequel to the original iNinja action game, once entered development for the GameCube at Argonaut Games. It would have taken place in the same setting as the original game, one that mixed ancient Japan with futuristic robots. While Argonaut Games worked on the game for a few months, sadly, financial issues forced the studio to close down in 2004. The game was never officially announced, with only concept art finding its way to the public. In 2005, TKO Software were working on a sequel as well, a successor to the Miss Pac-Man game. Miss Pac-Man Maze Madness was in the works. Miss Pac-Man Maze Madness 2 was originally planned to release on PS2, Xbox, and GameCube. The project was cancelled, however, apparently because the market was perceived to be too saturated. A game that also faced marketing issues was Worms Battle Rally. This was a racing game featuring Worms characters and weapons from the main series. It was developed by Team 17 and planned to release on GameCube, PS2, and PC. The game was cancelled in 2003 despite being nearly finished, as the game's publisher wasn't happy with it. Team 17 instead developed Worms Forts Under Siege at that publisher's request. Upon completion of Worms Fort Under Siege, the publisher promptly cancelled that as well. Thankfully, Sega later picked up the rights for Under Siege and released it to the world. Some scrapped games had less of a pedigree. Developed by Warthog and announced in July 2004, Milo and the Rainbow Nasties went through a whirlwind before its cancellation. It was a cartoonish, colorful puzzle game with a plot similar to Super Mario Sunshine. The player would assume the role of Milo, who with his pet chameleon had to bring color back to a world whose color was eaten away by bugs. Originally developed for the GameCube, PS2, and Xbox, Milo and the Rainbow Nasties eventually became a Gizmodo exclusive. In 2006, the owners of Warthog, Tighe Telematics, went bankrupt, and the game was cancelled. There's one way to ensure your game has the funding to make it to market, and that's to create a licensed game. Still, licensed games tend to come with their own issues. Metallica Damage Inc. was a licensed Metallica game announced in June 2003, being developed by Climax Studios. Rather than a music or rhythm-based game, Damage Inc. would have been a car combat game. Players could customize and swap out their vehicles, and could even hijack and steal other cars. As part of the deal, Metallica planned to release a song exclusively for the game. Allegedly, due to licensing issues, publisher Vivendi Games was looking for a reason to cancel the project. In 2016, P2P Online released footage of the game that had never before been seen, giving us all a taste of what could have been. Speaking of leaked footage, video of a never officially announced South Park game surfaced in August of 2014 after being discovered on Xbox development kits. It was originally intended to be the first game to officially map out the entire town of South Park, and would have released on the GameCube and PS2 as well as the Xbox. All 4 main characters would have been playable, with certain side characters also planned to make an appearance. The gameplay featured missions inspired by the show, such as Cartman attempting to sneak into a Special Olympics game. One of the higher-ups working on the game was said to be unprofessional, and is a possible reason the project didn't end up finishing with Ubisoft, as this person was later fired. LEGO Technic's Bionicle, also known as LEGO Bionicle: The Legend of Matanui, was a near-finished licensed game that wound up being canned at the last minute. It was first revealed in January 2001, with a PC version planned for the same year and a GameCube version in spring 2002. The GameCube release was the first to go, with the project being cancelled in its entirety shortly after. However, what was meant to be a GBA companion game, LEGO Bionicle: Quest for the Toa, did successfully release in 2001. As far as gameplay goes, Legend of Matanui would have had a similar structure to the Legend of Zelda games, with unlockable items granting access to previously restricted areas. The official reason for the game's cancellation has never been confirmed. One developer was told LEGO felt the game was of poor quality. Others said there was a shift in LEGO's management. Still, some think the game was cancelled so LEGO could pursue Argonaut Games' pitch for the franchise, a pitch that led to 2003's Bionicle the game. Recently, in February and April 2018, 2 builds of Legend of Matanui were leaked online. Fans have since attempted to use these builds to recreate the game as accurately as possible. This isn't the only canned LEGO game for the system. Though never officially announced, LEGO Racers 4 would have followed what developers considered the third LEGO Racers game, Drome Racers. Programmer at Attention to Detail Simon Goodwin said the game was cancelled after substantial development effort, and would have been more ambitious than Drome Racers. The entire game world would have been streamed from the DVD, allowing for a much larger play area than earlier LEGO titles and most console games at the time. Meanwhile, Bulletproof Monk was a game that, like the film, was based on Flypaper Press's comic book series of the same name. It was revealed in September 2002 to be published by Empire Interactive sometime around Christmas 2003 for consoles and PC. The game never made it to market though, as its developer, Mucky Foot, closed down before its release. Based on the Tremors movie series, Tremors the video game was announced in August 2002. Strangely, no images or videos of the game were shown when it was announced, despite the game being in development for the GameCube, PS2, and Xbox. Set in Perfection, Nevada, a few years after the first Tremors movie, players would take on the role of Burt Gummer, a survivalist featured throughout the franchise. The game was scheduled for release in fall 2003, but was quietly cancelled beforehand, likely due to its developers, Rock Solid Studios, going bankrupt. It's not all sad though. Rock Solid Studios was later reborn as Avalanche Studios, creators of Just Cause. Another scrapped GameCube game based on a film came from the E.T. franchise. Despite E.T.'s terrible history with video games, a few developers wanted to give the alien another shot. E.T. the Extraterrestrial: The Search for Dragora was a bizarre concept of a game. In it, a meteor crashes onto E.T.'s home planet, destroying its life-giving Dragora plants. E.T. and friends would search for seeds and attempt to cross-pollinate plants in order to recreate the elusive Dragora plant. A similar but different game was also planned for PS2 called E.T. the Extraterrestrial: Return to the Green Planet. Unfortunately, developer Z2 was absorbed by Warthog Games in 2002. Meanwhile, publisher New Kid Co. went out of business in 2005. Collectively, these events put an end to this bizarre game's chances of release. Some of you may know BattleBots as an American American TV show where remote-controlled robots compete in a robot combat tournament. Others might know it as a real-life company that also hosts robot competitions. Well, in 2002, a 3D game based on the show was in development for the GameCube and PlayStation 2. It was, funnily enough, also going to feature customizable robots fighting. While the 3D version of the game was cancelled, a 2D BattleBots game was ultimately released in 2003 by Majesco for the Game Boy Advance. Another TV licensed game for the system was scrapped. Galador, Defenders of the Outer Dimension, was a platformer announced in May 2002 at E3. A PS2 version of the game was also planned, along with a 2D side-scroller for the GBA with the same concept. Players would take on the role of Nick Bluetooth, the hero of the Outer Dimension. He'd fight his way through 4 unique realms to rescue his friends from the evil tyrant Gorm. Of the games being developed, only the GBA game was actually released. Due to financial instability, the remaining Galador versions were cancelled, and the team making the game were laid off. Games based on cartoons seemed to be popular during this time. Rocket Power Zero Gravity Zone would have been a spiritual successor to the skateboarding game Rocket Power Beach Bandit. It was in development during 2002 to 2003 for GameCube, PS2, and Xbox, but was never released. Then, in September 2009, Andrew Borman of P2P Online won an auction for an early alpha build of the game. He documented much of the build on his YouTube channel, preserving the developers' work on the game for history. In 2000, BAM Entertainment partnered with Cartoon Network to release games based on yet another cartoon license, the Powerpuff Girls. The Powerpuff Girls Shock of Ages was the last Powerpuff game to be announced by BAM, but it was never released. It's confirmed to have been in development during 2003. However, the last game BAM ever developed for Cartoon Network was Samurai Jack: The Amulet of Time, released in 2003. Some believe Shock of Ages was cancelled due to licensing issues, or because the relationship between BAM and Cartoon Network went sour. It's also possible financial issues were to blame, as both BAM and the game's developer, Sonari Interactive, haven't made a game since 2005. In 2018, a former developer shared details about G.I. Joe Operation Ultra, a previously unknown title. It was being made by Hasbro and Radical Entertainment of The Simpsons Hit and Run and Crash of the Titans fame for GameCube, PS2, and Xbox. According to the developer, the game would have featured 16 missions that broke down into 4 acts each. Based on the popular G.I. Joe toy line, it seems Hasbro got quite far in the design process for the game. Regardless, Radical Entertainment never fully started development. Another famous figurine or doll line also had a canned game on GameCube. Barbie Treasures in Time was a Barbie action-adventure game developed by Sierra and meant to be published by Vivendi Games. It was planned to release exclusively on GameCube in 2003. Players would have been able to join Barbie in her most exciting adventure ever, helping her travel through time, ancient towns, lagoons, shipwrecks, and forests to find lost treasures and unlock her way home. It also seemed to feature one of the more active versions of in-game Barbie, with her being able to flip, dive, and jump around obstacles. With a doll line just as popular, it's not surprising Bratz wanted to get in on that licensing money, perhaps a little too much. Bratz Formal Funk, alternatively known as Bratz Party Night, was in development in 2003. It was planned for the GameCube and PS2, but was never released due to what essentially amounts to a legal nightmare. In 2002, Ubisoft entered a licensing deal with MGA to publish Bratz video games. Not long after this, the popularity of the Bratz brand exploded. Now feeling unsatisfied with the deal, MGA tried to force a renegotiation of the license in 2003. When Ubisoft refused, MGA sued Ubisoft and took the license to other publishers. Ubisoft countersued, alleging MGA's termination of the license was invalid. The case was decided in Ubisoft's favor in 2008, and they were awarded $13.2 million for lost profits, damages, legal fees, and interest. As for Formal Funk, several of its ideas appear to have been reused in Bratz Rock Angels and Forever Diamonds. As far as non-traditional approaches to controls go, Yoshi Touch and Go experienced something of a transformation during development. Yoshi Touch and Go originally started out as a puzzle platformer on GameCube, with Yoshi as the playable character protecting Baby Mario. However, around the same time the Yoshi GameCube title was in production, other developers at Nintendo were experimenting with the idea of drawing as an integral gameplay element. During E3 2004, Nintendo showcased this new drawing gameplay in a separate tech demo for the Nintendo DS called Balloon Balloon Trip. This demo featured players protecting Baby Mario, who was tied to balloons. The players had to draw lines of clouds in the sky to guide Baby Mario to safety. The demo was well received, so the decision was made to revamp the GameCube Yoshi title to feature this gameplay. Yoshi Touch and Go became a DS game, and the original puzzle platformer GameCube game was left behind. Another Nintendo title with experimental gameplay, Stage Debut, was announced at E3 in May of 2002 and intended for a 2004 release. Similar to Mario Artist's Talent Studio for the 64DD, in Stage Debut, players would take a picture of their face using the Game Boy Advance Game Eye. They would then be able to put their image on a 3D model and interact with the game's virtual world. Though an interesting concept with many applications, IGN noted at the time that there wasn't much to Stage Debut other than changing the actors and the scenarios. The game ended up indefinitely delayed, likely because the Game Eye was cancelled. Nevertheless, the game still made an impact. In a 2008 IGN interview, Shigeru Miyamoto said Stage Debut was an inspiration for the Wii's Me channel. On top of this, Tomodachi Collection later reused some of the ideas planned for Stage Debut. In news that'll disappoint Earthbound/Mother fans everywhere, it recently came to light that there was a concept for an Earthbound sequel for GameCube that never got off the ground. In 2003, Yasuyuki Hone of Xenogear and Chrono Trigger fame had ideas for a GameCube sequel to Earthbound. Hone was able to pitch the project to Earthbound director Shigesato Itoi with the help of Satoru Iwata. Over the course of what was originally presented to Itoi as a lunch meeting, it slowly became apparent Iwata had arranged the meeting for the pitch. According to Hone, Itoi said, "Iwata, you arranged this, didn't you?" And the room went dead silent. Needless to say, Itoi wasn't interested in the sequel, but did praise the early game's crafted, fabric-based visual style. The pitch's ultimate failure can likely be attributed to the production of Mother 3, which lingered in development hell for almost a decade, but was revived for the GBA around this same time. While not a sequel, Factor 5's reboot of Pilotwings was another game from a familiar franchise that ran into difficulty. The goal was an immersive open-world Pilotwings game on the GameCube. Factor 5 experimented with head-tracking glasses that affected what was shown on screen in relation to the player's position, giving the illusion of depth within the display. Originally, the Pilotwings reboot had a more serious tone, but it gradually shifted over development until it was more in line with the past Pilotwing games. In time, development shifted to the Nintendo Wii, as Factor 5 later made the project its own IP. It went through the names Wii Flight, Wii Fly, and finally Wii Fly before ultimately being scrapped. Nintendo is nothing if not thorough, and appears to have wanted titles of all genres on the GameCube. Nintendo Pennant Chase Baseball seems to have been conceived after 2K Sports acquired exclusive rights to release the MLB games. The agreement halted EA Sports' MVP Baseball series, which had released the majority of its entries for the GameCube. This would have left a hole in Nintendo's sports gaming catalog. As such, Nintendo Pennant Chase Baseball was likely being made so the GameCube could have a baseball title. When 2K announced their MLB 2K6 would release on the GameCube, Pennant Chase Baseball was delayed and then ultimately cancelled, likely due to its redundancy. Of course, Nintendo isn't the only company making games for the GameCube, and they certainly don't have a monopoly on failed games. From never being greenlit to bankruptcies and legal issues, there are many reasons games fail. The Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse was a fairly unique game developed by 3DO. It would have had several playable characters, each with special weapons and unique abilities. Characters would have included a fallen priest and a young stripper. Stan Winston, who worked on practical effects for films like Jurassic Park, Terminator 2 Judgment Day, and Aliens, would have been involved with the project. The game was essentially scrapped when the company went bankrupt in May 2003. In 2004, the game's creator Michael Mendheim said the IP was far from dead. However, nothing has been heard about the game since. Another interesting title was Sergeant Cruz. While originally meant to release on PC in 2002, Sergeant Cruz was later announced for GameCube and Xbox as a Q1 2003 release. The game had an animated look similar to a Tex Avery cartoon. In it, the player starts out wearing only boxers. As they accrue clothing throughout the game, each new piece of Cruz's super armor gives him new abilities and artillery to fight the alien threat and save the world. Sergeant Cruz was meant to be a substantial game, with 30 missions across 15 stages, split-screen co-op, and a special mode where one player controlled the character's movement while the other controlled weapons, a surefire way to help siblings learn the value of cooperation. Then in the early 2000s, the game's developer Virgin Interactive went through a difficult period. The studio was eventually acquired by Titus Interactive, where it was rebranded Avalon Interactive. It was presumably during this time that Sergeant Cruz was cancelled. Monster Island was pitched in 2001 by Irrational Games as Rampage meets black and white creatures in a fully destructible environment. In it, players would take on the role of either a giant monster set on demolishing the city, or the authorities who protected it. Monsters racked up points climbing skyscrapers and eating humans, while the authorities attempted to stop them using several archetypal characters with different abilities such as the scientist, the girl, the engineer, the general, and the hero. With a living city and dynamic elements, the pitch was ambitious. In the end, the project was never greenlit. As far as ambition goes, though, Flux would be hard to beat. Flux was an experimental action platformer first revealed in April 1998, with a planned release on GameCube and PC. According to the game's developers, it would have been the first game to offer varying planes of gravity. Flux also had a unique mechanic wherein the player rotated the world along 3 axes to move through it and control the action. The idea was that when flipped, guard towers would become bridges and water mills would cause floods. The game's developers, 8 Cylinder Studios, approached several large companies in an attempt to publish the game, but appeared to never reach a deal to actually fund and publish it. Fans of Creature Labs and the Creatures series might remember Project Loki, but not for the game itself. According to a rumor, hidden within the Creatures games was said to be a secret adventure mode. Originally started as a joke by developers, the secret adventure mode eventually turned into Project Loki, a Creatures concept for the PS2, GameCube, and Xbox. Sadly, Creature Labs never found a publisher to fund development further than the initial prototype, and the game was scrapped. This wasn't the only game that didn't get far. L4 2 was a futuristic driving game being made around 1999 and 2000 for GameCube, PS2, and Xbox. It was speculated to be a cyberpunk take on Driver. However, it's likely L4 2 never got past its concept phase, which is a shame. The game would have featured art by American designer and concept artist Sid Mead of Blade Runner and Tron fame. Another sci-fi inspired title, Ion Runner, was a racing on rails shooter developed by Attention to Detail. 2 complete levels of the game were programmed and demonstrated to many publishers. Unfortunately, a deal wasn't reached before the company's funding was pulled, and in August 2003, production came to a halt. Many in the industry had seen Ion Runner's demos and were reportedly surprised the project was never finished. Though never officially announced, the arcade-like racer Stunt Pigs was discovered in 2014 when game collectors found its documents on a disc that previously belonged to M4 Ltd. While investigating, they found a game where players would drive around the city performing crazy stunts and collecting bonuses. According to a developer, Stunt Pigs was frantic and featured dark humor. It appears the game was canned when M4 failed to find a publisher. 12 Volt was also an arcade racer, first revealed in October 2004. The game was inspired by toy slot cars and would have been similar to Micro Machines. Players could race their tiny cars through houses and gardens. It was developed for GameCube, PS2, and Xbox, but there was also a GBA version planned, which would have been fairly different. It's unknown why this project was never released and how much was completed before it was canned. Another racing title was Backstage. This title was developed by Caraspace and was first revealed in 2003. Players became scooter rider Zack as he whizzed around an LA-like city performing different tasks like deliveries, taxi rides, collections, races, and even photography, all in an attempt to break into the film industry. One of its main features was its sophisticated traffic system. Zack never got his big break, and the game never saw daylight. Some may remember a 1990 MS-DOS racing game named Stunt Driver, in which players made their own tracks and raced them, either alone or with AI opponents. At some point, a new Stunt Driver was planned for the GameCube, and was even one of the earliest games announced for the system. It was also planned for PS2, but both versions were cancelled. Yet another driving game was the deceptively titled Knights, which wasn't a medieval fantasy game, but rather a combat car title. Developed by Eden Games and planned to be published by Atari, Knights would have released on GameCube, PS2, and Xbox. However, in May 2002, Eden Games was sold to Infogrames, and Knights vanished without a trace. Doomsday Rescue was one of the more unique car combat concepts out out there, starting off with a deadly asteroid shower hurtling towards Earth. Humanity's only hope is to relocate to Mars via rockets within 24 hours. Players are in charge of this effort, transporting scientists, doctors, politicians, and a few ordinary people through riots and disasters to the safe haven of the escape rockets. If the player accomplishes all of this, they too will be whisked away from Earth to start a new life on Mars. Doomsday Rescue was in development by Beyond Games in 2002, but was cancelled along with its other games, presumably because the company went bankrupt. Although the GameCube had some standout horror titles, it could have had even more. Nightmare Creatures 3 was a survival horror game developed by Callisto for GameCube, PS2, and Xbox in 2002. The game's original concept involved a heroine exploring 19th century Prague as a human during the day and merging with a raven to transform into a beast by night. As the beast, she would battle the monsters of her occultist nemesis, Adam Crowley. Ubisoft obtained publishing rights, but before the game could be finished, Callisto went out of business. Ubisoft then took over development. Reportedly, they threw out the previous concept and redesigned the game from the ground up. In 2004, an Ubisoft rep claimed the title hadn't been cancelled, but they've been quiet about the game ever since. Asylum was a first-person survival horror game being developed by Dark Black in 2002. Players would become a contestant in a TV game show that slowly transforms into a living nightmare. The game had its own physics engine that would bring destructible environments and ragdoll animations to the gameplay, complete with zombie limbs flying off when hit. Unfortunately, Dark Black struggled to find a publisher and ran into financial difficulty. It closed down and lost the rights to Asylum, presumably to Acclaim. It hasn't been heard of since. Crushed Baseball 2004 was a sports game with an over-the-top arcade style. It was scheduled for a March 2003 release, but was later cancelled due to BAM Entertainment being delisted from the NASDAQ in 2004. The game would have featured unusual characters with superhuman baseball-related abilities, and would have been released for GameCube and PS2. BAM went dormant in 2005, but a somewhat different GBA version was made by Kryptonite Games and published in 2004 by Summit Soft Entertainment. And then there was Extreme Pool. The game was developed for the GameCube, PS2, and PC. It was entirely finished, yet developers' graphics state for some reason struggled to find a publisher for it. It's a shame, as Extreme Pool featured a large set of background locations including an inner-city basketball court, a plane cruising at 30,000 feet, a Caribbean yacht, a city rooftop bar, and a Japanese garden. It had several modes, with some supporting 8 players at once. Another sports title was the boxing game by Climax, Title Defense. It boasted several technical achievements, including a full-on facial damage system and motion capture boxing animations that used 5,000 polygon models. It was inspired by Ready to Rumble Boxing and was planned to release on GameCube, PS2, Xbox, and PC. When it comes to other sports games, there unfortunately isn't much to be said about Ignition Entertainment's International Golf and Tennis. The title was announced for a May 15, 2005 release on both GameCube and PC, but when the date came around, the game was nowhere to be seen. NFL Quarterback Club 2003 was a licensed sports game being developed by Iguana Entertainment. It was meant to be published by Acclaim Entertainment, but never materialized. Some have speculated the game was cancelled due to EA's purchase of the NFL license. Upon closer investigation, however, EA didn't actually purchase the license until December 2004, which could point to other issues being involved. But there is one thing we know for sure: NFL Quarterback Club 2003 really did exist. One developer mentioned making a mini-game for the title on their LinkedIn. The action-adventure title, Lady Sia, was planned to get a GameCube sequel named Lady Sia 3D. The game's prototype was developed around 2002 and 2003 for the GameCube and PlayStation 2. It was a sequel to the original Lady Sia, which was released for the GBA in 2001. In 2003, its developer RFX Interactive closed down. The publisher, TDK Media Active, was acquired by Take-Two Interactive, thus putting an end to the project. Rather than a sequel, Extreme Force Grant City Anti-Crime was a third-person shooter spin-off of Namco's Dead to Rights games. It took place in the same city, but had a heavy focus on stealthy gameplay. In Extreme Force, players assumed the role of an elite cop attempting to stop a terrorist plot before the events of the first Dead to Rights game. It was also known as Strike Force and First Strike Grant City Anti-Crime. After nearly a year of development, Namco canceled the game, citing time time constraints as the reason. Picasso was a stealth thief title developed for the Dreamcast and first revealed in 2000. An extended development pushed it towards GameCube and PS2 instead. Despite this, only one playable build of the game is known to exist, with most of Picasso's gameplay ideas never implemented. Halfway through development, Picasso was radically changed. It shifted from its original idea into a stealth action hybrid in which two super rich people get into a bet about who could gather the most valuable art collection. The player assumed the role of a hired art thief competing against another thief to be the first to steal the art. Initial screenshots of the game show a male protagonist, though later screenshots show a female protagonist, indicating the main character may have been switched. However, Promethean designs went bust in the early 2000s and the game was cancelled. Ricochet Rick, meanwhile, was originally revealed as a GameCube exclusive in 2001. It was later also developed for the Xbox. Had it been released, players would have piloted the skies around legendary landmarks like the Eiffel Tower and the Great Wall of China. The project was cancelled early in development, likely because it was also developed by Titus Interactive. You see, Titus had another GameCube game that met with a terrible fate. Revealed in 2002, Tankers Smoking Barrels would have featured 6 different playable anime-style tank commandos in a futuristic Japanese setting. Players choose a character and set about smashing barricades, crushing army and police vehicles, destroying buildings, and generally causing chaos. But you could also free hostages, so really you're still a good guy. The game was meant to release in 2003, but never saw the light of day. Instead, Titus filed for bankruptcy on January 9, 2005, with $43.8 million of debt in tow. Don't Call Me Max was a fairly strange game that followed the story of Max, a kangaroo who runs away to join the circus his father once belonged to, only to discover it's been cursed by an evil ringmaster. Max must travel to magic realms to stop the ringmaster's curse, his only companion, a magical staff containing his father's spirit. This crazy game, developed by Prolific Publishing, never saw the light of day. But perhaps the most bizarre description of a game goes to Unity, which was described as a kaleidoscopic shooter. First revealed in 2003 to be published by Lionhead Studios, it was in development from early 2003 to late 2004 when its cancellation was officially announced. Both Jeff Minter, the game's developer, and Lionhead Studios cited the game's ambitious and experimental nature as the primary reason for the project's end. Peter Molyneux, Lionhead's co-founder, later added they believed the game wouldn't have finished on time. However, some of the game's technology may have later been reused for the game Space Giraffe on Xbox 360 and PC, so Unity may live on in some form. Speaking of long development times, Armada 2 Star Command was in development for so long it was originally meant to be a Dreamcast game. A 3D space shoot-'em-up, it eventually began being developed for the GameCube and PS2 under several names, including Armada's Revenge and simply Armada 2. After repeated delays and redesigns, and after working for 4 years on the game with limited resources, Armada 2 was laid to rest. The game Pickles, meanwhile, barely had a chance to get made. Pickles initially started as a way for Santa Cruz Games to test its developers' tools. The idea was to stack objects and characters without toppling them as enemies surrounded the tower and attacked in various ways. Pickles may evolve into Stackers, a similar demo that never developed further. Safari Joe: The Dark Continent was announced in April 2002 for GameCube and planned to be shown at E3. The game would have been published by Titus and was later revealed to be multi-platform. However, in early 2003, the game's website began directing users to Titus's website, the only hint to the fact Safari Joe: The Dark Continent was cancelled. In fact, many games seem to just vanish mysteriously. Trium Planeta was developed by F4 in the early 2000s. It was originally in development for the GameCube and PC, and seemed to take cues from games like Super Smash Bros. And Power Stone, with action-adventure overtones. Trium Planeta was ultimately cancelled in 2005. Another game by F4, Castle, was a real-time strategy tower defense game speculated to be a continuation of Pocket Castle, a previous F4 prototype. Castle was never released. Street Kings was a 3-on-3 basketball game, developed and meant to be published by Konami. Players would have started out as a hobbyist basketball player, at length ascending to become an all-star. While it was announced in early 2003 for GameCube and PlayStation 2, it was quietly cancelled the same year for reasons unknown. The ill-fated Kid Ninja: Spirit of the Dragon was developed by Asylum Entertainment, originally meant for release for the GameCube, PS2, and Xbox in 2003. The project was scrapped, but the game was later later revived, this time for development for the Wii. This game, too, was scrapped, leaving the spirit of the dragon a simple ghost. Another cancellation was Savage Safari Hunt, a hunting game announced for GameCube, PS2, and PC in 2004. In it, players would explore African jungles where dinosaur-like monsters reigned. Players could hunt 20 beasts across 10 missions with 10 weapons and other survival gear. The game had a running prototype, but Savage Safari Hunt was mysteriously cancelled. Both developer Coresoft and publisher Crave Entertainment continued to make games for many years after the expected release in 2005, making this a bit of a mystery. Another game that would have been interesting to see was Dead Rush, which was announced at E3 2004 with a 2005 release date. In it, an amnesiac named Jake must discover why the town of Eastport is riddled with zombies after an earthquake destroys most of humanity. Rather ambitiously, the devs wanted the game to have only a single loading screen on boot up. Afterwards, it would never load again, meaning it would have had continuous gameplay without pauses. This is even more impressive as Jake would have been able to drive vehicles around town and make new ones out of parts. Perhaps it's less surprising then that Dead Rush was cancelled. Reportedly, it wasn't turning out how the developers hoped. Pterosaur: Dawn of Destruction was being developed for GameCube, PS2, and Xbox by Atomic Planet in 2003. In it, players took control of a pterosaur, leading other dinosaurs to safety as the world was ending. Players would learn about the different dinosaurs, figuring out which dinosaurs were the most vulnerable, and how to go about saving them. Pterosaur: Dawn of Destruction was never released, for unknown reasons. It's likely Atomic Planet was unable to find a publisher for the game. On the 25th of February 2009, Atomic Planet went into administration and ultimately closed its doors. The developer Atomic Planet had 3 other games cancelled, all for unknown reasons. In development for GameCube, PS2, and Xbox in 2003, Nam: Tour of Duty was a first-person shooter where players took command of an entire platoon of soldiers. The game would have featured fierce battles diligently recreated from historic accounts of the 1968 Tet Offensive. Nam: Tour of Duty wasn't released and hasn't been heard of since. The second Atomic Planet game, Ace Squadron, was an on-rails shooter set in World War II. It featured various arcade-style air combat missions and was in development for GameCube, PS2, and Xbox. It's unknown as to why the game was cancelled, but it's likely the screenshots shown from the game were pre-rendered mock-ups, implying the game didn't get too far in development. The third Atomic Planet game, Tornado Alley, was also in development around 2002 to 2003 for GameCube, PS2, and Xbox. In it, players would get to take control of a tornado, doing as much damage as possible to its surroundings while following the contours of the landscape, watching for thermals, and building the tornado's power with the proper blend of warm and cold air. It was planned for release in 2004, and similar to Nam: Tour of Duty, it isn't really known why it was cancelled. Atomic Planet wasn't the only studio facing issues, however. The previously mentioned studio Dark Black was working on Wreckin' Crew in 2002, which was described as a mix between Blast Corps, Power Stone, and Bomberman. Players would control a team of demolition experts whose goal was to accomplish their mission's tasks and destroy everything in their path while doing it. It would have been released on GameCube, PS2, and Xbox, but never surfaced. After the release of the cult classic Metal Arms Glitch in the Systems, Swingin' Ape Studios began work on its sequel. Metal Arms 2 aimed to resolve the cliffhanger from the first game. However, work on the title ceased when Swingin' Ape were presented with an offer they couldn't refuse. They were contacted by Blizzard to work on StarCraft Ghost. As Swingin' Ape was a small team, they focused all their efforts on Ghost and ended up scrapping Metal Arms 2. StarCraft Ghost was meant to be a third-person shooter that let players walk through and experience the StarCraft universe firsthand. It was set 4 years after the conclusion of StarCraft Brood War and featured the character Nova investigating a military conspiracy. Not much is known about the game's storyline, but a novel named StarCraft Ghost Nova was released in 2006 covering Nova's backstory. The game was originally announced in 2002 to be developed by Nihilistic Software for the GameCube, Xbox, and PS2 before Swingin' Ape Studios took over development. Ghost's GameCube version was cancelled shortly after in 2005, and production on the game has been on indefinite hiatus since March 2006.
Bionicle was a line of LEGO construction toys launched around the world in 2001. The franchise came with its own meticulously crafted fictional universe, which unfolded across various mediums like videos on CDs packaged with the toys, and a comic book series produced by DC Comics. In its first year, the story revolved around 6 legendary heroes, the Toa, and their struggle to liberate the island of Matanui from the grip of an ancient evil. While the franchise was still under development in the late 90s, its accessible tale of good versus evil was deemed by the toy giant LEGO to be suitable fodder for a video game adaptation. Partnering with developers at Sci-Fi Inc., LEGO planned to release the first ever Bionicle video games in late 2001. The main project, a PC game, would go on to be extensively publicised by LEGO as it was being worked on, hyping up fans in the run-up to launch. However, within the final stretches of its development cycle, the game's release was unexpectedly and suddenly cancelled. With only limited information to go on, fans around the world were left to wonder, what was this game, and why was it never finished? 17 years on from its development, memories of the project have been kept alive by avid Bionicle enthusiasts such as those belonging to sites like the Biomedia Project. With assistance from them and Bionicle community The Beaver House, I've worked to demystify the circumstances surrounding its development. Revealing more of the game than ever before along the way, I'll be sharing with you the inside story behind the original LEGO Bionicle video game. Sci-Fi's Bionicle project is understood to have been established in around spring of the year 2000. The company was contracted by LEGO to make 2 games based around the property. The main project, a 3D action-adventure title, would be developed for PC. A port of it to the Nintendo GameCube was intended to release later, in spring 2002. The PC title would be accompanied by a smaller companion game on the Game Boy Advance, also set for late 2001. Sci-Fi at the time was a game studio on the rise, working on successful projects like StarCraft Brood War and the Nintendo 64 port of Tom Clancy's Rainbow Six. Based in Salt Lake City, Utah, the company formed what LEGO believed to be a safe pair of hands for translating Bionicle into video game form. It would help to further boost the franchise's mindshare going into the crucial holiday period of 2001, or so was the plan. The games were intended to be canon to the larger Bionicle series, offering fans a new way to experience the universe's mythology and ongoing plot up close and personal. It was all based around the 2001 Bionicle story, where the series villain Makuta has used his dark influence to corrupt the wild animals of Matanui called the Rahi. At his behest, they have begun attacking villages in an effort to seize the island. The Game Boy Advance title, originally named LEGO Bionicle Tales of the Tohunga, was planned to serve as a prequel to the main experience on PC. It was a top-down adventure game in which players took control of Takua, a Matanui islander on a mission to gather the Toa Stones and rescue his elders from the Rahi. The story would wrap up with an ending stinger directly leading into the start of the PC game. In the last cutscene, Takua summons the Toa, 6 warriors prophesized to defeat Makuta and bring order to the Bionicle world. The PC game, the full title of which was LEGO Bionicle The Legend of Matanui, would have opened with the Toa emerging from their canisters after crashing to the island as their adventure begins. In The Legend of Matanui, there were 6 playable characters, all lifted from the original line of Bionicle toys from 2001. Each of the 6 Toa was represented with their own level reflecting their individual elemental powers. They all landed onto different sectors of the island into environments relevant to their abilities. For example, Tahu, the fire element, finds himself navigating a volcano. The Legend of Matanui took the form of a 3D third-person action-adventure game heavy on platforming elements. Each level was a uniquely themed open environment, and saw one of the 6 Toa helping out the islanders native to that region of Matanui they've arrived on. Each hero would face tasks like rescuing the villagers from attacking enemies and returning missing items to their owners. These quests would see you wandering all over the region, solving puzzles and fighting various infected creatures. Combat mostly involved the Toa firing energy spheres from their bodies, aimed using the in-game cursor to neutralize enemies. Characters could also perform melee attacks, such as Kopaka, who could slash his sword. Its structure in many ways is reminiscent of early 3D Legend of Zelda games like Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask. Players unlock new abilities by collecting and equipping Kanohi masks and other artifacts found on the island. These could then be used to reach previously inaccessible parts of the map. The similarities don't end there. Each character had their own version of a grappling hook item that would help them zip up towards higher ground, which functioned in a manner very similar to Zelda's hookshot. The game featured a wealth of different items like this that would grant special powers. The first you would have used was Onua's mask, the Kanohi of Strength, that allows him to move heavy objects. Others could enable such traits as a protective shield, super speed, temporary invisibility, mind control, and even telekinesis. These masks could be cycled through on the fly at the push of a button. In addition to these, each Toa could perform character-specific actions that were unique to them. Onua could dig through soft dirt using his claws, Gali was able to swim underwater, Pohatu could kick Koli balls and ride wild animals, Kopaka could snowboard down hills on his shield, Lua could swing from tree to tree using vines, and Tahu lastly could surf on lava. Once they have gathered the Kanohi and completed tasks for the villagers, the elders of each area would eventually deem the Toa ready to face their last test. They would face a monster based around their elemental power, one of 6 disciples of Makuta. Once disposed of, the boss would leave behind a Makoki stone for you to collect. As the Toa moved on to a new area, you were intended to see a transitional cutscene where they meet the next character you would be controlling. In these cinematics, the player would get to see the two Toa briefly interact before passing on the Kanohi masks they've gathered to aid the next character in their journey. This storytelling device meant that players would get to keep the abilities they have earned from level to level. Ultimately, after destroying the elemental bosses and bringing peace to each region, the 6 Toa would finally unite as the endgame draws near. In an extended pre-rendered cutscene, we see them use the Makoki stones they've collected to open an ancient temple within which Makuta and his minions reside. After being transported inside, the 6 Toa split up to explore its mysterious inner workings. They happen upon pods that fuse the two groups of Toa into 2 merged beings, combining their strength to become the Toa Kaida. We see the Kaida battle some of Makuta's most powerful Rahi, the Manas, before turning back to their original forms. As the last section of the game starts to unfold, players would have had to explore Makuta's treacherous lair as each of the 6 heroes. In a test of what the player has learned throughout the game, each Toa had a room devoted to them. Players would be required to complete a platforming section as each character and escape their room before time ran out. Around this point, the Toa were intended to finally confront Makuta, although this part of the game was never completed. Former developers say the minutiae of how it would have played out was never set in stone. This is one of the few sections of the game that wasn't finalized. While not without bugs, the vast majority of it was up and running. The ending, on the other hand, had been finished. In another pre-rendered cinematic, a beam of white light shoots out of the temple, signifying Makuta's defeat. It's visible from every corner of Matanui, and we see the islanders dancing in celebration. This sequence was seemingly inspired by the ending of Star Wars Return of the Jedi. Evidence of this can be found in the game's data. The video file for this cutscene was named Ewok Celebration. The game's menu showed the developers had plans for additional bonus content outside the main story, most of which was left incomplete. Some work was done on a gallery filled with art that players would have been able to print off. They'd also intended to include a number of instructions manuals showing how to build the game's enemies out of real Lego. The project being shut down was the culmination of a somewhat uneasy journey for Sapphire. Although the team functioned well, and the game itself was made in a creatively healthy environment by all accounts, there were some fairly serious problems surrounding it throughout. One hurdle that both Sapphire Bionicle projects briefly dealt with, while not nearly as severe to them as issues that would later arise, involved a dispute with LEGO itself. In May 2001, the official North American launch of Bionicle was imminent when the Maori people of New Zealand began raising concerns that the franchise was appropriating Polynesian culture for corporate gain. Bionicle in its first year was heavily inspired by Polynesian culture, something LEGO itself did not shy away from admitting. However, the matter became contentious when it emerged the company had used existing words from their language and reappropriated them as terms specific to the Bionicle universe. One example of this that the Maori people found to be particularly egregious was their use of the word tohunga. In their language, this word is reserved for an expert practitioner of an art or skill, such as teaching or healing. LEGO had used this word as the name for one of the main species of characters in Bionicle. The tohunga was sold as a line of toys throughout 2001 and were planned to be a major part of their upcoming video games. May 2001 saw the Moldy issuing a statement to challenge LEGO's appropriation of their language. In particular, their statement targeted the Bionicle video games in development and hoped the words in question would not be used by them. In summer 2001, LEGO instructed Sci-Fi to remove tohunga and other offending words from their games. As such, all mentions of tohunga were scrubbed from the Legend of Matanui's dialogue mid-development. The Game Boy Advance game was notably affected too, since it was all about the tohunga characters, and up until this point had even been called LEGO Bionicle Tales of the Tohunga. Sci-Fi officially retitled it as Quest for the Toa, and LEGO would later rename the species in the Bionicle lore as Matoran. Aside from this, one major issue lurking beneath the surface during work on the Legend of Matanui was Sci-Fi's growing financial strife. Several developers I spoke to for this video shared that they experienced recurring problems with receiving payment for their work on the game. Former employees from Sci-Fi say that in the final several months of development, their paychecks were reduced without warning and were delivered less frequently as time went on. Workers are said to have been putting in shifts of up to 70 hours per week during summer 2001, but in some cases, Sci-Fi neglected to pay them regardless. At the height of crunch time, where developers found themselves in the offices until late at night, whole weeks of work were being left unpaid. Sci-Fi's money troubles were being exacerbated in no small part by a company spending spree that had begun earlier that year. In spring 2001, they had moved to a larger and much more expensive office complex in American Fork, Utah. The management decked the place out with new furniture and an elaborate business phone system which is said to have set them back tens of thousands of dollars. On top of that, the costs of rent were much higher than those of their previous base of operations. By August, it was becoming increasingly apparent that Sci-Fi was in dire straits. Rumors spread among employees that the company's management was attempting to court private investors in order to ease their financial woes. One former developer reports hearing that a wealthy local businessman from the Salt Lake City area was in talks to sell a private plane to raise money for them. Ultimately, Sci-Fi was unsuccessful at securing additional funds, and the situation would only worsen as 2001 went on. During the Legend of Matanui's last 2 months under development, a handful of employees were left completely unpaid. The project would finally be cancelled on October 10th, 2001. A group of developers were promptly laid off without severance pay. They filed with the state of Utah to retrieve back wages, and Sci-Fi would eventually reimburse them a year later. The blow dealt by the Legend of Matanui's cancellation sent the company into a slow death spiral. Following years of financial instability, Sci-Fi stopped working on games in 2004 and officially went out of business in 2007. Despite its fate, the game developed something of a cult following online among enthusiasts. The project took on a life of its own as fans desperately sought to understand more about it and why it had disappeared. One factor behind this enduring fascination with the game is that LEGO went to great lengths to publicize its existence throughout its development. Starting in January 2001 through a sponsorship deal with Nestle, Bionicle branded discs were bundled with packs of Cheerios cereal. These CDs contained an early version of a pre-rendered cinematic from the game. The Bionicle comics repeatedly mentioned the video game in their back pages and later ran a competition where readers could win a free copy of it when it was finished. LEGO also had plans to bundle a collectible Bionicle mask exclusively with copies of the game. They began promoting the title on the official Bionicle website soon after this, and even put out a public call for beta testers. Fans in North America could apply to test the game and provide feedback. In return, they were promised a spot in the credits, a free copy of the game, and a complimentary Bionicle hat, but the tests never took place due to the project's unforeseen discontinuation. The reasoning behind the Legend of Matanui's cancellation has long been the subject of debate. One long-standing rumour alleges that the game was rife with glitches and therefore could not be fixed within a reasonable span of time. Some ex-members of the team, however, refute these claims and say that they they were on schedule to release it in late 2001. A former programmer who worked on it estimates it was around 90% completed by the end. By all accounts, the order to shut it down, which came from LEGO itself, was unexpected and sudden. Members of the development team were relayed an unofficial reason for cancellation by Sci-Fi's higher-ups, but some of them were skeptical of how reliable this information was. Multiple sources say that the justification given to them relates to a major event in world history that had taken place only 1 month prior: the attacks of September 11th, 2001. Allegedly, the managers of Sci-Fi claimed that LEGO no longer wanted to pursue a game with violence in it after 9/11, although, out of every developer that shared information in the making of this video, all of them found this reasoning to be incredulous. They assert that LEGO had closely overseen the project, receiving updates on a weekly basis, and would have voiced their concerns had they objected to any violence in the game. A good example of that in effect comes from Darvel Hunt, who was a programmer on the project. He was responsible for writing code for physics-based destruction that would cause enemies to shatter into individual LEGO pieces when they were destroyed. LEGO instructed him to cut this feature for being too violent. Speaking to one of the most senior staff members on the project, who oversaw the entire game's development, reveals the true justification LEGO gave to Sapphire for cancelling it. According to project leader Brent Fox, LEGO was subject to management shifts in late 2001, bringing new blood not only to the Bionicle franchise, but their whole media output. These changes in staff had huge implications for everyone working with their video game department at the time. Every project under the umbrella of LEGO Software was put under scrutiny as staff with a new vision for LEGO's video games came to power. At the same time this was happening, another game studio, Argonaut Games, had started pitching a Bionicle game of their own to the team newly chosen to oversee LEGO's media production. Argonaut's people proposed a video game that would land on every major platform at the time. Swayed by Argonaut's ideas, LEGO's management chose to discontinue the Legend of Matanui at Sapphire and move forward with their game instead. This was all part of an effort to take the franchise in a direction more in line with their vision for it. Over $1 million is said to have been spent on it up until this point, not including marketing expenses. Since the Legend of Matanui was a project made under the previous LEGO management, the new guard felt no obligation to keep it going and chose to start over with a clean slate. Another reason factoring into the decision included problems the development team had experienced with chip compatibility. The game was incompatible with a lot of video cards on the market at the time, something they had yet to resolve. Plans for a GameCube version set to come out in 2002 were scrapped as well. LEGO and Sapphire had a good relationship with Nintendo, and had intended for their machine to be the only console it would release on initially. Sapphire's Bionicle game for the GBA, Quest for the Toa on the other hand, was released, since it had already been finished. It included the end teaser setting up the plot covered by Legend of Matanui, a game that would never officially be released. Instead, the 2001 Bionicle story was told through other mediums like novels, comic books, and the Matanui online flash game. Regardless of issues with how it was ran, some former developers remember their time at Sapphire fondly. If footage recovered from the game's development is any indication, the team took to their work with a sense of humour. Brent Fox, one of the project's heads, filmed a light-hearted behind-the-scenes video detailing day-to-day life at the studio. This sense of humour appears to have rubbed off on the game itself too. Hidden in the game's files were a number of explicit secret animations labelled as cheats that can be imported into builds and used with certain characters. Onua can flip off the camera, Pohatu can urinate, and Tahu can fart over his fire sword, creating a flame jet. In the years after development ended, enthusiasts have tried to track down what remains of the game. Nearly 17 years later, Bionicle fan hub The Beaver House and the Biomedia Project, a site for preserving material from the series, finally made a breakthrough. In February 2018, they received a functioning build of the game dated July 23rd, 2001. The build was largely unfinished, but they were able to enhance it considerably, fixing bugs and updating its visuals to run in high definition. In April 2018, I was able to recover the most recent build of the game known to exist, which was taken on October 23rd, 2001. This was made possible by the actions of senior staff on the project in the days after its cancellation. They made copies of the final build on CDs and privately distributed them to members of the team as a keepsake to remember it by. I passed the build on to representatives of the Beaver House, who formed a new development team called Lightstone to update the game and bring it to the public. Thanks to their efforts, it can now run on modern Windows PCs in widescreen, HD, and 60 frames per second. The team has aspirations of recreating the planned game as accurately as they reasonably can, attempting to stay true to Sci-Fi's original creative vision. Lightstone plans to distribute the game for free via biomediaproject.com.